from Corsica to the fourth Rome. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 76 Investigation, Part 1. Accompanied by several Corsican sailors, Lawrence and the other two boarded the only two-line battleships of the Corsican Navy one by one. Lawrence had no interest in studying these battleships, while Grosso had already reached a perfect understanding of ships, so the main purpose of the two was to accompany and explain to Nelson. However, after visiting for a while, Nelson became a little uninterested, because these two battleships were both third-class ships like the Reasonable. There was almost no difference in the internal structure, and even the layout of some cabins and artillery was not as good as the configuration on the Reasonable, which made Nelson not have a deep impression of the two battleships. What really attracted Nelson were the small auxiliary ships anchored in the port. These auxiliary warships, which were born to adapt to the Mediterranean environment, are rarely seen in the Royal Navy. After all, the focus of the Royal Navy is still on ocean-going warships. My god, the sails of this ship are so big. Nelson boarded a Mediterranean three-masted ship with Lawrence and Grosso. As soon as he got on the deck, Nelson stared at the sail above his head that was several times wider than the hull, and couldn't help but sigh. Lawrence immediately winked at Grosso, who could only sigh helplessly, walked behind Nelson, turned into a commentator, and said in broken English, "This kind of ship is also called a fast triangular sailboat. It only takes about 100 people to operate it. The sails are enlarged, so the windward ability is particularly strong. The speed is very fast, and the draft is very shallow." While explaining, Grosso also incorporated his years of experience into it. "Arab pirates especially like this kind of ship. Damn, I've encountered it a few times. They hang all the sails and run faster than rabbits. I can't catch up with them. But, come with me," Grosso said, and took Nelson and Lawrence to find the ladder leading to the lower deck. After the three climbed down the ladder, Grosso pointed to the 20 neatly arranged cannons on the lower deck and said, "In a normal paddle sail, this is the position of the rowers, but in order to increase the firepower of this ship, the rowers were cancelled and replaced with a gun deck. This makes its steering performance not very good, which is a defect." Once Grosso began to explain, Nelson would listen attentively, and from time to time he would ask his own questions, some of which even made Grosso scratch his head, not knowing how to explain. When the three of them had almost seen all the major ships in the port, it was already sunset. Nelson's face was flushed with excitement, and it was particularly bright under the setting sun. He bowed solemnly to Lawrence and Grosso again, and said sincerely, "Thank you very much, Mr. Bonaparte. Such an opportunity is really rare. And you, Mr. Grosso, your knowledge is really profound." Lawrence smiled and said nothing, while Grosso waved his hand and said casually, "Profound knowledge, if you throw a pig on the sea for 20 years, it will also understand these things." Nelson was amused by Grosso's words, then looked up at the sky and whispered, "Thank you again, both of you. The time for free activities is almost up, and I think I should." "Wait." Lawrence suddenly interrupted him and said slowly, "Actually, I'm also very curious about things in England. Can you answer some of my questions? I will explain them to you on the Reasonable." "Really? That's great, sir. Please go ahead." Nelson became excited when he heard what Lawrence said, and said repeatedly. Lawrence first asked a few very routine questions, such as where Nelson's hometown is, what the scenery there is like, and what his family is like. Nelson answered Lawrence meticulously. Seeing that the foreshadowing was almost done, Lawrence suddenly asked casually, "By the way, little Nelson, do you know the old man your uncle helped down today? He doesn't look like a soldier." "That old man?" Nelson closed his eyes, frowned and thought for a while, then shook his head and said, "I don't know him. He rarely leaves the cabin, and my uncle hardly mentions him. Oh, by the way, I once heard my uncle call him a count." "Count? Did he come to Corsica alone?" Lawrence asked with a frown. "Not really. He has dozens of servants, but he and his servants live in a cabin alone, and sailors are not allowed to enter that cabin. The servants should leave the rational later." Lawrence then asked a few more questions in a roundabout way, but that was all the information Nelson knew, so Lawrence finished with a few routine questions and sent Nelson back. TSK, there's nothing to gain. The old man even kept it a secret from his own people. After sending Nelson away, Grosso leaned against the wall, scratched his hair in annoyance, and said, I wasted so much time talking to that kid. Alas, my tongue is dry from talking to that kid. Lawrence pondered and analyzed the information provided by Nelson, and said casually, really? I think we gained a lot. At least little Nelson is very grateful to us, isn't he? Go away. If he were a big man like a king, it would be useful for him to be grateful to me. What's the point of this little brat being grateful to me? Grosso waved his hands at Lawrence and said unhappily, see the correct version in 1619 book bar. But what are you going to do? There are only 2 valuable points in the kid's words. An earl has dozens of servants. But there are a lot of such people in England. That's true, but the identity of the old man and the purpose of his coming to Corsica must be clarified. Lawrence said in a deep voice with a gleam in his eyes. He had a vague feeling that the English earl had gone to great lengths to hide his identity and come to Corsica for something that would affect the fate of Corsica, and Lawrence would not sit idly by and watch this completely unknown event happen to him. What should we do? Find a few more sailors from the reasonable to get information? Invite them to the tavern and drink a few bottles of rum, and they will even tell you how many illegitimate children there are. Grosso frowned and suggested. Lawrence just shook his head slowly and said, those ordinary sailors probably don't know as much as Nelson, and it's easy to arouse suspicion, to get information on such a large scale in such an open manner. That's true. Then where are you going to start? Grosso sighed a little frustrated and asked Lawrence. Lawrence rubbed his forehead for a while, and said slowly, it seems that we can only start with those followers. They can't even know who their master is. This, Grosso said hesitantly, what's the difference between this and asking the sailors of the reasonable for information? We will still be discovered. Lawrence did not reply immediately, but raised his head and closed his eyes, thinking for a long time. After finalizing a rough plan in his mind, he nodded to himself and said, no, there is still a big difference. What's the matter? What's the big deal? I can't blatantly capture a Royal Navy soldier into the dungeon. Chapter 77 Investigation, Part 2. The next morning, at Lawrence's home, Lawrence walked out of the bedroom in his bathrobe and couldn't help yawning sleepily. After experiencing the series of events yesterday, Lawrence hardly slept well that night. After all, the existence of the English Earl was like a time bomb to Lawrence, making him uneasy. Especially Lawrence didn't know when, where, and to whom the bomb would explode. Rubbing his eyes for a while leaning on the railing on the second floor, Lawrence looked down at the living room and found that Anna had gotten up early and was now lying on the dining table concentrating on copying and sorting a large stack of papers. After Cyril Russell's death, Lawrence did not ask Anna to stop sorting and reporting these messages. On the contrary, with Lawrence's continuous funding in the past 2 years, the scale and level of members of the children's gathering have been constantly improving. Not long ago, Lawrence even saw a piece of information from the youngest son of a certain congressman in Anna's report, which made Lawrence more determined to maintain this news channel. Anna, who was concentrating on her work, did not notice Lawrence walking behind her until Lawrence gently stroked her soft hair. Anna was startled and jumped up from her seat like a little rabbit, with several pages of paper scattered on the ground. Sir, you scared me to death, Anna said softly, turning her red cheek slightly. Lawrence leaned over to pick up the papers scattered on the ground, handed them to Anna and said, thank you for your hard work, Anna. Is there any special news? With the increase in the scale of children's gatherings, Anna's workload has also increased. The intelligence that needs to be processed and screened every week has changed from a few pages of paper to a large stack of documents that are several centimeters thick. This makes Anna often have to start a day's work early in the morning like now, and at the same time, take care of the housework of this big house. Although Anna said that such a fulfilling life makes her happier, Lawrence also remembers what Anna has done. This week, there is really nothing special, Anna said, picking up the draft she had compiled and taking a look at it, then handed it to Lawrence. Lawrence took Anna's manuscript, pulled out a chair and sat down, looking at it and casually asked, I remember that there were several people working in the governor's mansion at the party. Is there anything unusual in the governor's mansion? Ah, there are indeed these people. Anna responded, very skillfully took out 2 records from the pile of documents, and read them carefully twice and said, but according to what they said, everything is normal in the governor's mansion. Really? Lawrence nodded, thinking silently in his heart, in this case, then most of the Earl's entourage should not live in the governor's mansion. According to Nelson, there are dozens of entourages. If all of them live in the governor's mansion, the corresponding various living supplies will definitely be purchased in advance, including the food supply in the restaurant. According to Anna, the people working in the kitchen and those who participated in the purchase did not find such signs. It seems that only the count and several personal servants should live in the governor's palace. Lawrence closed his eyes and analyzed, and secretly came to a conclusion. Such a conclusion is also very common. After all, these followers also have different identities, such as guards, scribes, maids, servants, and even for such dignitaries, there may be priests, doctors, and staff accompanying them. For followers with lower status and less important positions, according to etiquette standards, they are generally not allowed to be entertained with the master. And for Lawrence, these followers with humbler identities are his best choice to open a breakthrough. Anna. Lawrence has made up his mind, and said to Anna in a deep voice, help me keep an eye on all the larger hotels in Ajaccio, including taverns that provide accommodation. Also, please go back and look for the intelligence in the previous few issues to see if there is any relevant news. Yes, sir. Anna nodded seriously and meticulously wrote down Lawrence's request on paper. Lawrence stood up, sighed, and couldn't help touching Anna's head. He also knew that such a request would increase Anna's workload, so he said softly, thank you for your hard work, Anna. I will find someone to share this with you soon. No, sir, I can do it alone. Anna carefully put away the paper she had just written, and said in a lower and lower voice, I'm very happy and fulfilled in this kind of life. I feel that I'm useful to the gentleman, so I can stay here forever. At the end, Anna's voice was as soft as a mosquito. Lawrence could only see Anna's lips trembling slightly, but he couldn't hear what she said at the end. After Lawrence sorted out his clothes at home, he went out to the patrol station to complete his job. Although the appearance of those uninvited guests from Britain made Lawrence feel a strong sense of crisis, before receiving further news from Anna, Lawrence still had to appear in front of the public without distraction as usual. This is to increase exposure in the eyes of the public, and secondly, it can slightly anesthetize Governor Paulie to show that he has no interest in these British people. However, during the afternoon patrol, Lawrence still went to the port of Ajaccio. The Reasonable is still anchored in its original position, and occasionally British sailors can be seen in groups of 3 or 2 on the dock. Although there is really nothing fun to be found at the dock of Ajaccio, for sailors who stay at sea all day, the opportunity to walk on the ground with their feet on the ground is not available every day. Hey, Mr. Bonaparte. A correct version in the 16:9 book forum. Lawrence deliberately stayed around the Reasonable for a while, and sure enough, after a while, he heard a childish voice calling him on the deck. Nelson was lying on the side of the ship with difficulty. He was not as tall as the side of the ship, so his feet were in the air at this time, but he still waved and shouted excitedly to Lawrence on the dock. Who? Mr. Bonaparte, I can't believe I see you again. Nelson trotted down from the Reasonable, and came to Lawrence's side, panting and excited. I'm responsible for the security and order of this area, and I often come here. Lawrence said kindly, how is it, little Nelson? How is your life in Ajaccio? It's terrible. Nelson shook his head repeatedly, and said very dissatisfiedly, there is nothing to do on the ship, and we are not allowed to enter the city. It's too boring. But the ship should be very lively, after all, there are so many sailors. After hearing this, Nelson shook his head even more vigorously, and said repeatedly, they talk about women, money, and wine every day. It's even more boring than the calm sea. Really? Lawrence replied casually, and took the opportunity to lead the topic to what he cared about most. Doesn't the old man have a lot of servants? There should be interesting people among those people. They? Nelson curled his lips and said, they usually stay in their cabins, and they left the Reasonable last night. Lawrence's eyes condensed, but his face remained calm and asked, "Left?" "Yes, they left at midnight." "Oh, I see." Lawrence nodded and pondered, then deliberately turned his head to look at the sky and said hurriedly, "Oh, sorry little Nelson, I still have work to do. I have to leave." "Of course, Mr. Bonaparte," Nelson said, taking off his hat and waving to Lawrence, who was walking away quickly. Chapter 78 Interrogation, Part 1. The next morning, in an inconspicuous two-story tavern in the northern part of Ajaccio. Oh, damn. These hotels run by country bumpkins are of poor quality. Dr. Mariah sat up from the bed in a room on the second floor with a painful look on his face. He couldn't help but pound his sore back and shoulders, cursing to himself. As the Earl's personal physician, he didn't enjoy the glory and wealth in London, but at least he could wake up on a soft cotton bed every day, instead of the damp, moldy, and creaking broken wooden board under him now. Not to mention that he had to squeeze into a bed with another fat follower, otherwise this tavern couldn't accommodate all the followers. Mariah muttered in dissatisfaction while moving his still sore body and walked towards the lobby downstairs. The style of this two-story tavern is very common throughout Europe. The first floor is used as a lobby to entertain drinkers, and the second floor has rooms for accommodation. When Dr. Mariah arrived at the lobby, the only 10 tables were already crowded. Judging from their attire and language, they were all British people who came with the rational. According to the Earl's order, unless they were summoned by the Earl, they had to stay in this tavern. "Hey, Mariah, you are here too." Mariah had just walked down the stairs when a sharp-nosed and monkey-faced attendant stood up and shouted at him, which immediately attracted the attention of other attendants. Mariah glanced at the attendant, ignored him, and found a seat to sit down. He always regarded himself as a superior person who had received medical education, and looked down on these peasants from the bottom of his heart. These ordinary followers were also aware of this fact about Mariah. Seeing that this self-righteous doctor was actually squeezed in this shabby tavern like them, they all started to make fun of him. "Oh, Dr. Mariah, I thought you were with the Count." "Hey, I heard that even that bald clown is with the Count. Why are you here?" "Ha ha ha, Dr. Mariah, why don't you shave your hair and dress up as a clown?" For a moment, the whole tavern was filled with a happy atmosphere. Mariah looked at them with gnashing teeth and couldn't help muttering, "The Earl is in good health these days, so he didn't let me follow him." "What do you know? He is in good health?" The sharp-nosed and monkey-faced attendant at the beginning put one foot on the table, exaggeratedly holding the end of the tone, and said loudly, "I see, it was you who wanted to bleed the Earl last time and scared him." Someone in the crowd immediately said, "That's right, you also used leeches to suck the blood of the Earl, and made him faint in bed for 3 days and 3 nights. Ha ha ha, and you also let sheep dung for the Earl to suck, and his nose almost couldn't smell anything. You, what do you know? I have been to a graduate school." Dr. Mariah was so angry that his face turned red, pointing at the crowd of people who were making trouble and arguing incoherently. However, his argument was soon drowned out by the continuous laughter. Just as everyone was laughing and making fun of Mariah, there was a clang and the door of the tavern was suddenly pushed open. The laughter stopped abruptly. The British people looked at the door in confusion. The tavern had been booked by them, and there was a sign saying no entry at the door. Who was the one who broke in without a clear mind? There were 4 smiling men standing at the door. They were all dressed like waiters and holding a large silver plate in their left hands. The silver plate was piled with wine bottles. The leader said in broken English, "Welcome, friends from afar. We, the hospitable Corsicans, share our wine with you. It's all free." The British people looked at each other. They still understood what the man meant, especially the free wine, which made them excited. The waiters didn't waste words. They put the trays on the table and opened all the bottles at once. "Oh, someone is bringing us some wine. Maybe they are trying to please the Earl." The British people were excitedly talking to each other. Although these people looked suspicious, the liquor in their hands was genuine, so they just regarded it as a gift from the Corsicans. "Oh, it's gin again. I didn't expect to be able to drink this after leaving England." A brave attendant stepped forward and picked up a bottle and looked at the label. He found that this was the gin that was very popular in England, also known as golden wine. "Drink to your heart's content, friends," the leading waiter said with a smile. At this point, the British people did not refuse. They whistled and cheered and stepped forward to pick up the bottle and fill their glasses with this liquor. Although they were the attendants of the ale, most of the people who stayed here were not people of status, so it was not easy to drink such liquor on weekdays. Even Dr. Maria, after hesitating for a while, held up a wooden cup and joined the ranks of pouring wine. In just a few moments, all the gin was gone, and the British people were also drunk that their faces were red and they couldn't stand steadily. Some of them who couldn't drink much were already sleeping on the table. Because of his hesitation, Dr. Maria only got half a glass of wine, but he had to sit in his seat and drink it in small sips. The 4 waiters watched the British people distribute all the liquor patiently, and then slowly put the bottles away. A perfect version of the book in 1619. One of them smelled the strong smell of alcohol in the pub, and said in English with a mocking look, "What a bunch of country bumpkins, it's like they have never drunk alcohol." He spoke in a low voice, but many British people still heard this extremely insulting remark. Dr. Maria also heard this, and couldn't help frowning at the waiter who made the mocking remarks. He always felt that something was wrong. "Hey, what did you say? Country bumpkin? We are from fucking London." An attendant, under the influence of alcohol, slapped the table with a loud slap, pointing at the waiter and shouting, "London? Is this the name of a village?" The waiter twitched his lips, took a step forward arrogantly, and pointed at the British people and said, "A bunch of English mudlegs, be honest." "What? What did you say? Want to fight?" As soon as the words came out, the atmosphere in the pub exploded immediately. The British people who were already drunk could not stand such words immediately, and rolled up their sleeves and surrounded them. "What? You still want to beat me? Go ahead and try it." Seeing that a dozen British guys surrounded him, the waiter's arrogance became even stronger, and he shouted at them, "Fuck." An Englishman could no longer stand such shouting, and directly stepped forward and knocked the waiter to the ground with a punch. The others followed and cursed, pushing the other 3 waiters to the ground and beating them up. Some even picked up empty bottles and chairs, pushed through the crowd, and prepared to throw them at the waiters on the ground. The tavern was in chaos in an instant, with curses and shouts coming out one after another. Some British guys were so drunk that they punched their own people. Dr. Maria swallowed uneasily and did not join the fight. He had already found something wrong. The waiter was obviously a Corsican. Why did he provoke them in English? It was as if he did it on purpose. Just when Dr. Maria realized this, the door of the tavern was pushed open again. Following closely behind were dozens of fully armed patrolmen holding muskets who filed in, led by a young man holding a dagger. He said in a deep voice to everyone in the tavern with a stern face, "Friends of England, this is Napoleon Bonaparte, the defender of order in Ajaccio. I order you to immediately stop the ongoing criminal activities. Thanks to the book Friends Unction for his monthly ticket support." Chapter 79 Interrogation, Part 2. Maria stood up uneasily, looking at Lawrence and his patrolmen in panic. He was the most sober of all the British present, because he had only drunk half a glass of gin. Seeing Lawrence's appearance, he was more convinced that the waiters who delivered the wine definitely did not come with good intentions. Moreover, it took only 2 minutes from the time they surrounded and beat up the waiters to the time the patrolmen entered. It was as if the patrolmen were standing outside the door ready to break in at any time. The British in the tavern looked around in confusion. Dozens of patrolmen were pointing their guns at them. Under such a death threat, their minds, which were dazzled by alcohol, became more sober. The 4 waiters who had just fallen to the ground and were beaten up by fists and feet also took advantage of this gap to quickly get up and ran behind the patrolmen with bruises all over their bodies. "Everyone, hold your heads with your hands and line up to come out of the tavern." Lawrence raised the tip of the knife and pointed it at the British people, saying sternly. The British looked at each other in panic, and no one was willing to be the first to step forward. After all, their master's order was to keep them away from the tavern. Now, if they disobeyed this order, they might get into more trouble. Lawrence saw that these people were hesitant, so he didn't waste any words, and winked at the patrolmen, asking them to tighten the encirclement. Seeing these patrolmen approaching them slowly, these British people finally couldn't stand it anymore. Several people standing on the periphery had their heads almost touching the muzzle of the gun. According to Lawrence's request, they had to hold their heads with their hands and walked out of the tavern in fear. When it was Mariah's turn, although he shouted to Lawrence loudly, "Sir, Your Excellency, I didn't participate in the fight. They can testify. You can't do this to me." But both Lawrence and the British continued their own business, as if they didn't hear it. Especially the British. They can't protect themselves now, and no one will be kind enough to testify for him. Many British even looked at Mariah with gloating, as if dragging Mariah into the water made them feel better. Under the supervision of the patrolmen with guns, all the British in the lobby were driven out of the pub and surrounded on the street outside. The waiter who had provoked the British just now was touching his wounds and came behind Lawrence. "How are your injuries, Grosso?" Lawrence looked back at the blue and purple scars on his body and asked with a worried frown. "It hurts so much, but it doesn't matter. I have been beaten more than you have. In this case, I just need to curl up on the ground and hold my head. I will be fine." After being beaten for a few minutes, "The other 3 people are similar to me, and they are not serious," Grosso said indifferently, pressing a bruise on his hand to speed up the dissolution of the blood. "Sorry, but you are the only one among the patrolmen who can speak English," Lawrence said a little apologetically. "It's nothing. There's no blood. Anyway, I'm with you, kid." Grosso continued to press the wound, looked at a large group of British people squatting on the ground with their hands on their heads outside the tavern, frowned and said, "However, we can just catch 2 British guys and take them away. If you drive them all out like this, won't it make things worse?" Lawrence took a look at the situation outside. It was noon now, and there were still many pedestrians on the street. Many passers-by who noticed the situation here had gathered around. "It's all the same." Lawrence shook his head and said, "Even if we only catch 1 person, the news will still reach poorly in the count. It's better to make things bigger and seem more legitimate." "Is that so? What should we do now?" Grosso thought for a while and said that the 4 waiters just now were all pretended by him and other patrolmen. It was no problem to deceive these newly arrived British people, but for the citizens of Ajaccio, Grosso's face was easily recognized. "Well, the 4 of you stay in the tavern first, wrap your faces with bandages, and come out after I gesture." Lawrence glanced at Grosso. His scarred face was so recognizable. Including the other 3 patrolmen, because they often appear in public, they still need to disguise themselves in order not to be exposed in front of the citizens of Ajaccio. After instructing a few victims, Lawrence walked out of the tavern. The crowd gathered outside had formed a 3-layer circle. The innermost was the British squatting on the ground with their heads in their hands, followed by the patrolmen pointing guns at them, and the outermost were the citizens of Ajaccio who were watching the excitement. Seeing Lawrence walk out of the tavern, the citizens moved their feet tacitly and made way for him. "Sir, you can't do this to me. I'm a gentleman. What is my crime?" Mariah, who had been squatting on the ground honestly just now, stood up immediately when she saw Lawrence coming over and said to Lawrence hurriedly. Lawrence glanced at him and said casually, "Gathering to fight, intentional injury. I didn't participate." Mariah spread his hands and said loudly, "Besides, I'm a subject of His Majesty the King of England. You can't judge me according to Corsican law." Lawrence ignored the first half of his sentence, deliberately sneered, looked around at the citizens around him, and said, "I'm very sorry to disturb your normal life, fellow citizens of Ajaccio, but a horrific attack case just happened in this tavern." After that, Lawrence clapped his hands in the tavern and signaled Grosso and the other 3 patrolmen to come out. A correct version of the book in 16:9. The 4 of them supported each other and walked out with difficulty. Their faces were wrapped in bandages like mummies, with only a pair of eyes exposed, and the waiter uniforms on their bodies were almost turned into rags in the beating and tearing just now. Not to mention that their exposed skin was covered with purple and blue bruises and abrasions, some of which were still bleeding. To be fair, these injuries were not serious and would heal after a period of rest. However, the visual impact of these injuries was quite huge in an instant, and the surrounding citizens exclaimed when they saw this. This was the northern part of Ajaccio, and such serious attacks would not happen on weekdays. "Don't panic, fellow citizens," Lawrence said calmly. "The murderer has been controlled by us, the group of British in front of you. And just now, one of them, As he said, Lawrence pointed at Mariah, who was standing with his chin, and continued, "He told me that I can't judge him according to Corsican law, and what I want to say is that I will not allow such bullying of Corsican compatriots to happen in front of me. Even if I have to use means outside the law, I will try him." British. Lawrence stared at Mariah, but spoke in Italian. "Don't think about being domineering here. This is Corsica. This is Ajaccio. Now, everyone listen to my order. Take these criminals back to the patrol dungeon." Amid the cheers of the citizens, the patrolmen began to tie ropes for the British and escorted them back to the garrison. On the way back, Grosso carefully approached Lawrence and whispered, "By the way, Kit, why did you speak Italian to those British guys just now? They didn't understand." Lawrence tilted his head slightly and said in a low voice with his lips almost motionless, "It doesn't matter, I didn't say it to them." Grosso was stunned for a moment, then reacted and said unhappily, "Damn, it's the same trick of coercing public opinion again. You kids should go into politics. It's too despicable." Grosso, "I prefer to call it efficient." Lawrence said this softly, quickened his pace, and walked a few steps to avoid exposing Grosso's identity. Thanks to the monthly ticket support of the book friend Luo Shupenslave. Chapter 80 Interrogation, Part 2. In order not to arouse suspicion, Lawrence sent someone to secretly send Grosso and the 3 injured patrolmen to Grosso's own station on the way. The Count's followers had also been imprisoned in the dungeon by Lawrence. "Is everything done?" Lawrence sat in the lobby of the station and asked Old Scene, who was coming up from the dungeon. Old Scene scratched his head awkwardly and said, Lord Bonaparte, you brought too many people this time, and the cells can't hold them. It's okay to squeeze together." Lawrence waved his hand and said, "Anyway, they won't stay in the dungeon for long." "Not for long?" Old Scene pondered this sentence with some doubts, but did not ask Lawrence out loud. As a smart man, Old Scene knew very well what he should know, and what he shouldn't know. "Old Scene, bring me a sober person among those people." Lawrence was giving orders to Old Scene when he suddenly remembered Mariah, who had just argued with him. He didn't seem to have drunk much, so he should be more relaxed when asking questions. So he said, "By the way, bring up the man who just called himself a gentleman." "Yes." Old Scene responded, turned back to the dungeon, and soon brought Mariah to Lawrence's side. Mariah's face was 9 parts of fear and 1 part of anger, and she walked to Lawrence's side uneasily. Having just walked around the dungeon and seen the numbness and pain of other prisoners, he now lost his confidence. "Mr. Bonaparte, what do you want to do?" Lawrence patted the chair beside him and said with a smile, "Please sit down, sir." Then, Lawrence said to Old Scene behind him, "Old Scene, you go to the dungeon to supervise and settle those British people." "Understood." Old Scene left quickly after saying this. As smart as he was, he immediately understood what Lawrence meant. He didn't want a third person to hear his conversation with the British. "Mr. Bonaparte, sir, please believe me, I really didn't participate in the fight. I didn't beat those 4 Corsicans." Mariah sat next to Lawrence tremblingly. As soon as she sat down, she kept muttering, "Okay, I'll ask the questions, you answer them. As long as you cooperate, I'll find out the truth. Do you understand?" Lawrence waved his hand to interrupt Mariah's muttering and said directly, "What's your name? Where are you from? What do you do?" "My name is Mariah Hawke, from London, and I'm a doctor." "You came on the reasonable, right? Why did you come to Ajaccio?" Lawrence nodded and asked, "This?" Mariah's face showed obvious hesitation, and after a while, she said, "I came with my employer." "Employer? Who is your employer?" The answer he wanted was already in front of him. Lawrence suppressed his excitement and asked without changing his face. When Mariah heard this question, her expression froze for a moment, and then she said nervously with a scattered look, "It's a wealthy businessman named Louis Hanna." Lawrence glanced at Mariah. His unsettled eyes were a typical manifestation of lying in a nervous situation. In addition, the identity of the employer Mariah mentioned did not match the Count Lawrence knew. So Lawrence directly warned in a deep voice, "Mr. Mariah, let me give you a friendly reminder. I will ask other people the same question. It will be very interesting if I get different answers." Mariah swallowed nervously. He could also hear that Lawrence knew he was lying. What's more, Lawrence looked at Mariah who was trembling all over, and continued, "If everyone else gave the same answer, and you, Mr. Mariah, gave me a different answer, I would have to reconsider who was the leader of this fight." Mariah was incoherent and stood there, and finally said a complete sentence. "But, Mr. Bonaparte, we have received orders to reveal the identity of the employer, and we really can't reveal it." Well, it seems that Mr. Mariah has a strong sense of contract. Lawrence's sharp eyes swept across Mariah's face, and he said slowly, "I think I should talk to others. I believe that not everyone is as determined as you. You can go back to the dungeon." Hearing Lawrence's words, Mariah was still stunned in his seat. It was as uncomfortable as death for him to return to the dark and damp dungeon. It was not a place for a well-educated gentleman like him to stay. What's more, in Mariah's eyes, once the iron door that imprisoned him was closed, who knew if there would be a chance to open it again? Lawrence also noticed Mariah's struggle, and did not urge him to leave, but sat in his seat, and waited for him to make a decision. A perfect version in the 16:9 book forum. After a long while, Mariah suddenly said hurriedly, "His name is William Pitt, also the Earl of Chatham, and a politician. Mr. Bonaparte, I can only tell you so much." This short sentence seemed to drain Mariah's strength, and after saying it, he collapsed on the chair, as if he had fainted. "William Pitt, old William Pitt!" Exclamation mark. Lawrence's pupils trembled slightly, and the appearance of this name was really beyond his expectations. Although William Pitt did not seem outstanding in the entire history, if we focus on Europe at the end of the 18th century, then his name is definitely well known. Because he was the former Prime Minister of the Kingdom of England and the #1 hero who commanded the English army to win the 7 Years' War. Even Frederick the Great of Prussia once commented on him, a real man born after a long period of colic in England. Although he had a lot of thoughts in his mind, in front of Mariah, Lawrence pretended to be indifferent, as if he heard the name of a farmer. He just nodded with satisfaction, and did not continue to ask about William Pitt. Lawrence knew very well that after Mariah was released, he would definitely be asked about the content of his conversation with him. If he continued to ask at this moment, he would be out of the topic of the interrogation of the fight. Then, Lawrence asked a few questions about what happened in the tavern at that time without caring. Mariah was very excited about these questions, and kept telling her innocence. "Okay, Mr. Mariah, I believe you are innocent. You won't stay in the dungeon for too long." After a while, Lawrence waved his hand impatiently to interrupt Mariah and drove him back to the dungeon. With Mariah's departure, Lawrence was finally able to clear his mind and began to ponder the information he had just obtained in combination with his memories of his previous life. William Pitt. It is now 1770, so he should no longer be the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. In Lawrence's memory, Pitt lost his political power in 1768, was forced to resign from the position of Prime Minister, and was awarded the title of Earl of Chatham. Obtaining a noble title is not a good thing for British politicians, because it means that they will not be able to participate in the House of Commons, and can only stay in the House of Lords, which has little power. And this time, Pitt was willing to leave the political centre of London, and take huge political risks, to come to remote Corsica, which made Lawrence believe that he must have come with some unknown purpose. As the former Prime Minister of the Kingdom of England, it is no wonder that Paulie had such a high-level reception for his visit that day. What puzzled Lawrence even more was that such a person actually chose to hide his identity and came to Corsica on a warship. This combination can only mean one thing, that is, Pitt's visit to Corsica is not a private act, but a meeting with Paulie on behalf of England. Moreover, the content of the talks is probably a secret agreement that must be kept secret from the Corsicans and even from neighboring countries. Now it is just a small step closer to the truth. William Pitt, what exactly is he and Paulie conspiring? Chapter 81 Goodbye Paulie. In the patrol station, in line with the principle of doing a complete show, after Lawrence learned the identity of the Earl, he still asked old Scene to bring a few more people up and ask them the same questions, but skipped the question about Pete's identity. After all, the reason for arresting them this time was to gather a crowd to fight, in order to prevent the outside world, especially Paulie, from noticing that he was secretly exploring Pete's information. Such a process was still necessary. As the last British man brought up was interrogated, Old Scene rubbed his sore wrist, put the quill back into the ink bottle, and said to Clarence, "Lord Bonaparte, the record has been written down. What should I do next?" "Nothing." Clarence picked up Old Scene's record and glanced at it. Then he put the record on the table to indicate that Old Scene should collect and organize it properly. He sat in a chair with his whole body relaxed, closed his eyes and rested, and said casually, "Just wait here." "Wait? Who are you waiting for?" Old Scene asked, puzzled. Clarence, who was lying in the chair, nodded slightly and said softly, "According to the time, Paul should have received the news, and the person sent to find me is probably on the way." Sure enough, as soon as Clarence finished speaking, a man dressed as a guard stood at the gate of the patrol station, looking inside nervously. Although the gate of the station was open, the guard saw Clarence lying in the hall, and knocked on the door carefully. After seeing Clarence nod slightly to allow it, he walked in. "Lord Bonaparte, Governor Paul ordered you to go to the governor's palace to see him immediately." The guard walked in front of Clarence, leaned forward slightly, bowed respectfully, and then said hurriedly. Clarence also stood up from his chair, nodded to the guard, and said, "I know, I will leave soon, you go back first." "Yes." Clarence looked at the guard's back as he hurriedly left, and couldn't help muttering to himself, "It seems that our Lord Paul is very angry." Old Scene looked at Clarence in surprise and asked, "How did you see that?" "Under normal circumstances, if Paul wants to see me, he should send his secretary to notify me, but today he just randomly assigned a guard to come," Clarence explained while buttoning up his uniform jacket. Facing Paul's anger at the governor's mansion this time was not Clarence's biggest worry. What made Clarence more cautious was the possibility of meeting William Pitt inside. Since killing Zluo, Clarence had fewer and fewer legitimate reasons to enter and leave the governor's mansion, which was also Paul's intention, to keep Clarence away from the political center of the governor's mansion. This time, although Paulie summoned Clarence with anger, it was also a good opportunity to find out the purpose of William Pitt's coming to Corsica. If this opportunity is missed, Clarence may not see Pitt even after Pitt and Paulie reach a secret agreement. Clarence took a few deep breaths to adjust his mood and prepared his words to deal with Paulie in his mind. Then he left the station and went to the governor's mansion alone. Although Clarence had not been to the governor's mansion for a while, the environment here remained unchanged. It's just that the number of guards at the door and the observation tower has increased significantly, and some of the guards are even wearing the uniforms of the National Defense Force. It seems that Paulie specially transferred people from the army to ensure Pitt's safety. "Mr. Bonaparte, you are here." Paulie's secretary was standing at the gate waiting for Clarence. He still had a stern face and a serious look. When he saw Clarence coming, he greeted him briefly and turned to lead Clarence in. However, what surprised Clarence was that the secretary did not take him to Paulie's study, but led him to a corridor leading to the restaurant, and finally stopped beside a man with his hands behind his back. Clarence looked at the man in front of him, and it took him a while to recognize that it was Governor Paulie. He was wearing a heavy silver wig on his head, and a thick layer of lead powder on his face for whitening. His clothes were neither casual clothes nor military uniforms for formal occasions, but a gorgeous dress Clarence had never seen before, with complicated patterns embroidered with gold thread. While Paulie hadn't spoken yet, Clarence secretly glanced at him with his peripheral vision, and saw that Paulie's chin was full of oil, and there was still cream at the corners of his mouth. If you smell it carefully, you can still smell a faint smell of wine on him. According to dining etiquette, you must wipe your mouth after eating. Clarence glanced at Paulie and thought silently, so, it seems that Paulie left the banquet halfway through. Is it because of me, or is there a problem with William Pitt? Paulie turned around and faced Clarence. Although he had no expression on his face, he could already see the anger between his brows. "Clarence Bonaparte, I heard that you arrested a group of British people." "Yes, Governor, I'm very sorry for not informing you in advance." Facing an angry person, the most taboo thing is to confront him head on. Clarence also knew this very well. He lowered his posture as soon as he came up, and then said, "But the situation was a bit urgent at the time. You know, the British beat the Corsicans in Ajaccio. If foreigners are allowed to show off their power like this without being punished, I'm afraid the people will have strong dissatisfaction." Clarence thought of this step when he arrested people in the tavern in the morning. So he deliberately made a big scene and raised a big banner for his behavior. There is no wrong version in the 1619 book forum. In this way, even if Paulie was extremely angry with Lawrence, he could not openly oppose or criticize Lawrence's actions. He could only criticize him privately, like he is doing now. Then, you should know whose people you have arrested. Lawrence glanced at Paulie cautiously. He could not hide the fact that he knew William Pitt's identity from Paulie, and Mariah would definitely tell Paulie later, so it would be better to admit it now. I learned about it during the routine interrogation. To be honest, I didn't expect that such a big shot would come to Corsica. Paulie suddenly stepped forward, poked Lawrence's chest with his fingers, stared at Lawrence and said, "Lawrence Bonaparte, I solemnly remind you here, you'd better swallow the identity of Sir Pitt. Otherwise, even if your brother pleads for you, I will shoot you myself." "I understand, Governor." Lawrence stood there like a wooden stake and endured it, allowing Paulie's fingers to poke his chest heavily again and again. HMPH. Paulie finally stopped and looked at Lawrence, who seemed to be submissive. His anger subsided a lot, but he still said with great dissatisfaction, "Also, among those people you arrested, pick 2 of the lowest status as the main criminals, and deal with them to calm the public anger. Release the rest immediately." Before he finished speaking, Paulie continued, "In addition, I want you to make financial compensation to the British who were detained for no reason, and pay for it with your own money. Also, you must find the time to make a public apology to them." Paulie made a series of demands in a row, but Lawrence nodded and agreed to all of them without thinking. Although these demands had some impact on his prestige, the most important thing at the moment was to calm Paulie's anger and find a way to contact William Pitt. Paulie looked at Lawrence nodding like a chicken pecking at rice, and his heart was relieved a lot. Just now he was a little suspicious whether Lawrence was deliberately trying to find out about Pitt, but now seeing Lawrence so submissive, such doubts were also eliminated a lot. After all, in Paulie's eyes, although Lawrence was a little unruly, Paulie was still confident that he could hold this kid firmly in his palm. Humph, this kid finally knows who is in charge of Corsica. Paulie looked at Lawrence with satisfaction and thought so. Lawrence in front of Paulie kept nodding, while secretly observing Paulie's reaction. When he saw that Paulie's face was slightly relieved, Lawrence knew that the opportunity had come, so he said boldly, "By the way, Governor, I wonder if I can meet Mr. Pitt." "Huh? What do you want to see Mr. Pitt for?" Paulie's face suddenly stiffened a little, and he asked sternly. "I arrested his entourage so rashly, and I must express my most sincere apology to him." Lawrence covered his chest, looked heartbroken, looked at Paulie firmly, and said sincerely, "If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels." Chapter 82 Treatment, Part 1. Apologize. Governor Paul thought for a while, and seemed to think it was necessary. Pitt himself was very angry when he learned that his entourage was thrown into the dungeon. Lawrence kept an eye on Paul's expression. When he saw Paul nod slightly, Lawrence couldn't help but feel happy, thinking that he had done his job and would see Pitt soon. However, Paul suddenly sighed, then shook his head and said, "But let's wait until next time. Sir Pitt suddenly feels unwell and is resting." Unwell? Lawrence couldn't help but frown and glance at Paul. He didn't look like he was lying. In addition, Lawrence observed and speculated at the beginning, Paul left the banquet halfway. It is not difficult to think that the situation just now should be William Pitt's sudden illness, which led to the interruption of the banquet. However, Paul's words just now suddenly reminded Lawrence of William Pitt's health problems in historical records. In Lawrence's impression, Pitt has been suffering from mental illness and gout in his later years. Even the reason why he was forced to resign as Prime Minister in 1768 was largely because his illness made it difficult for him to have the energy to complete his work. And what Paulie said, Pitt's sudden physical discomfort, it is very likely that he ate some forbidden food at the banquet, which caused gout to attack. Wait, this may be an opportunity. Lawrence's eyes suddenly lit up, realizing that this might be a great opportunity to get close to Pitt. Although Lawrence was not a medical expert in his previous life, because there were elderly people in his family suffering from gout, Lawrence had spent a lot of time on the knowledge of treating and regulating gout. Even if he was not as good as those professional doctors in his previous life, Lawrence dared to say that in this 18th century, his understanding of gout was absolutely unmatched. If he could use this knowledge to alleviate Pitt's injuries, then he could stay with Pitt often in the name of treatment. Gout is a chronic disease that requires long-term treatment. As long as Lawrence's treatment plan is effective, Pitt will rely on Lawrence's treatment for a considerable period of time. After all, the pain of this horrific disease is still unbearable even in the 21st century with many painkillers. After quickly making up his mind, Lawrence immediately put on a concerned expression and said, "Sir Pete, are you feeling unwell? Is it a gout attack?" How do you know?" Paulie looked at Lawrence suspiciously and said. Lawrence was not in a hurry. He remembered that Mariah was Peter's personal doctor, so he explained, "I heard from Mr. Peter's entourage that one of them is a doctor." "That's right, Mr. Peter is recuperating at his residence." Paulie didn't think too much, waved to Lawrence, and directly ordered him to leave, saying, "I will convey your apology on your behalf. Now, go and do your thing." "Wait, Governor." Lawrence didn't leave, but stood there and said mysteriously, "You may not know that I actually have a lot of research in medicine." "You? I don't see the shadow of a doctor in you." Paulie frowned and said mercilessly. In the past 2 years, he hadn't heard that Lawrence had any research in medicine. "Ahem, actually I went to university in Pisa." Lawrence ignored Paulie's ridicule and lied without blushing or beating his heart, pretending to be a scholar and appearing more reliable. Lawrence had no memory of whether this body had ever been to university. However, his brother Carlo had indeed studied at the University of Pisa, and as his younger brother, it was reasonable for Lawrence to have the same educational experience. Paulie also thought of this. In his eyes, Lawrence was born in Florence, and it was not surprising that he had been to university. However, Lawrence saw that Paulie still had some doubts. So he continued, "Governor, if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Peter has eaten a lot of fish recently, and when the disease occurs, the middle joint of the toe is red, swollen and painful. In addition, the body should also be accompanied by obvious fever, and hiss, how did you know?" Paulie blurted out in surprise after hearing this, his eyes almost widened. He did not expect that Lawrence not only accurately described Peter's symptoms without even meeting him, but also told him about his recent eating habits. Even Paul, who was present at the time, did not notice some of the symptoms Lawrence mentioned. It was only after Lawrence mentioned them that Paul remembered that this was indeed the case. Even Paul's secretary, who was standing behind Lawrence, couldn't help but look at Lawrence a few more times. He hadn't seen Paul show such a shocked expression for a long time. Seeing Paul's surprised expression, Lawrence secretly breathed a sigh of relief, somewhat glad that his guess was correct. Gout patients are very averse to eating fish, and Corsica is a small island. Lawrence guessed that Paul must have a variety of fish to entertain Pete. A correct version in 16 to 9 book bar. Knowing this, Lawrence could easily deduce that Pete's attack this time should be acute gout caused by diet, and Lawrence also knew the symptoms and coping methods of this disease. "As I just said, Governor, I do know a little about medicine." Lawrence straightened his chest and said confidently, "I have seen many cases like Mr. Pitt's. Maybe I can." Paulie recovered from his shock and looked at Lawrence with a complicated expression. From Lawrence's performance, Paulie basically believed that Lawrence did have some ability in medicine. And for Paulie, if Lawrence could really treat Pitt's condition, then his negotiations with Pitt would definitely be much easier. Because William Pitt was the plenipotentiary envoy for this negotiation, his personal emotions and feelings would have a considerable impact on the negotiation. It was also for this reason that Paulie spared no effort to entertain Pitt with the highest standard of treatment. When Paul looked at Lawrence, his hostility suddenly faded, and his tone softened. He changed his angry expression and asked excitedly, "Lawrence, are you sure?" "Of course, I can guarantee it with my reputation." Lawrence nodded. Such confidence also came from his advanced knowledge. Even if he didn't give Pitt medication, Lawrence was sure that he could greatly alleviate Pitt's current condition just by helping him improve his living habits. Paul stood there and stared at Lawrence for a while, as if he was weighing the pros and cons. Lawrence calmly waited for Paul to make a decision. He knew that with Paul's character, he would not miss this great opportunity to get closer to William Pitt. "I don't need your reputation to guarantee it, Lawrence," Paulie suddenly said in a deep voice, "but if your treatment has no effect, or even has a negative effect, then I don't need to tell you the consequences." "Of course," Lawrence replied without hesitation. "Even if there is a risk of treatment failure, this opportunity to get close to Pete cannot be missed." "Very good. I believe you are a young man who is sure of everything. Come with me." Paulie said this and turned around to lead Lawrence forward. "Thanks to the monthly ticket of the book friend call RGUI bar. Thank you for your support." Chapter 83 Treatment, Part 2. Lawrence followed Paulie to the northeast corner of the governor's mansion. At the door of a quiet two-story mansion, 2 armed guards in bright red uniforms stood at the door. In Lawrence's impression, no Corsica armed forces had uniforms of this style. They seemed to be Pete's own guards. Lawrence glanced at the guards at the door. From this detail, he also saw that Paulie really attached great importance to Pete's visit. Normal guests living in the governor's mansion, even if they have their own guards, are not allowed to be brought into the governor's mansion, because such behavior is a naked expression of distrust of the security of the governor's mansion. Pete's guards can not only enter the governor's mansion, but can even walk around the mansion with guns. It seems that Paulie has indeed made a lot of preferential treatment for Pete and his party. Paulie greeted the guards at the door, and then took Lawrence into the mansion. After entering the house and closing the door, Lawrence casually looked around the house. It was obviously in the English court style, very similar to the layout he had seen in the movie. The exterior of this house was clearly an Italian Renaissance style building. Lawrence glanced at Paulie and probably thought that Paulie had changed the interior decoration specifically for Pete. In addition to Pete and several servants in charge of daily life, Captain Morris also lived here. When he saw Lawrence and Paulie come in, he stood up and greeted them with some surprise. "Governor Paulie, Lieutenant Colonel Bonaparte, you are here." Paulie nodded, frowned, and asked, "How is Mr. Pitt?" Captain Morris smiled bitterly, looked up and pointed to the master bedroom on the second floor with the door closed, sighed, and said in a low voice, "It's better now. When the disease was at its worst, you could hear his groaning when standing outside." Paulie nodded seriously, motioned Lawrence to follow him, then walked up to the second floor with light steps, and knocked on Pitt's door. "Who is it? I told you not to disturb me." An old and weak voice came from inside, and it can be heard from the tone that Pitt has been tortured by gout, and is quite exhausted. Paulie held the door handle, but did not open the door rashly. Instead, he stood outside, and said in a deep voice, "Mr. Pete, it's me. I brought a doctor for you." "Doctor?" Pete's voice immediately became sharp and angry, and he shouted at the top of his voice, "You brought that bastard Marat? Get him out. Get him out with his bloodletting therapy." Lawrence, who was outside the door, looked at Paulie awkwardly, shrugged and explained, "Marat should be his personal doctor, but it doesn't seem to satisfy Mr. Pete." Paulie had to say excuse me first, then pushed the door open, and walked in with Lawrence. The furnishings in the bedroom were simple, with almost no furniture, only a bed, a set of tables and chairs, and a wardrobe. The old man on the bed was leaning weakly against the head of the bed, looking at the visitor with his eyes slanted. Pete's eyes were quite sharp, as if he was not affected by the pain at all. Just by scanning Lawrence felt that his body temperature had dropped by several degrees. Lawrence also looked at Pitt with some curiosity. Apart from the young Napoleon and Nelson, this was the first historical celebrity Lawrence had seen in person. As recorded in later generations, he was not tall and thin, but he had an arbitrary and domineering temperament, and his words and deeds revealed a unique sense of pride. Lawrence put away his gaze and silently overlapped the old man in front of him with the image in history. Pitt wiped the cold sweat from his forehead with his hand, frowned and looked at Lawrence for a while, then said coldly, "Paulie, who is this?" Paulie did not answer, but winked at Lawrence. Lawrence also understood and stepped forward, bowed to Pete, performed impeccable etiquette, and then introduced himself. "It is an honor to meet you, the respected Earl of Tatham, Mr. Pete. I'm Lawrence Bonaparte, a knight of Florence, and a loyal subordinate of Governor Paulie." Paulie on the side couldn't help but secretly glance at Lawrence after hearing this. Paulie didn't even believe a single punctuation mark in the last half of the sentence. However, thinking that he still had to rely on Lawrence to treat Pete, Paulie could only smile and nod to show his approval. Peter looked at Lawrence again, then turned his head and leaned on the bed with his eyes closed, saying without interest, "Paul's subordinates, what's the matter?" Lawrence knew very well that anyone would become impatient and irritable under great pain and torture, so he didn't say anything polite and went straight to the point and said, "Sir, I have a way to relieve your condition." Upon hearing this, Peter immediately opened his eyes, turned his head, and looked Lawrence up and down carefully, and sneered, "Why? You want to bleed me too?" Lawrence scratched his head in embarrassment, thinking that it was no wonder that Mariah, as a personal doctor, was not brought by Peter. Bleeding every day has left a psychological shadow on Peter, but it can't be blamed that Peter is so resistant to bloodletting. It's really that this outrageous treatment was too popular in Europe in the 18th century. Even Washington, the founding father of the United States, was bled 4 times in a row by 3 doctors after he fell seriously ill and finally passed away that night. It can be seen that even the nobles may not receive formal medical treatment. No knife will be used at all. Lawrence shook his head repeatedly. Although in later generations, severe gout does require surgery, there were no qualified sanitary conditions and tools in the 18th century, not to mention that Lawrence did not know how to perform surgery. Check out the correct version on the 16 to 9 book forum. Oh, no knife. Peter was a little interested and sat up with his arms and asked, "Tell me, Lawrence, right? What can you do?" Since Lawrence was brought by Paulie, Peter also trusted him a little. After hearing that he didn't have to endure the pain of bleeding, Peter had more expectations for Lawrence. "Excuse me, Sir Peter, please let me see your feet," Lawrence said politely. Peter didn't waste any words and directly lifted the quilt on his body and waved Lawrence to come over. Lawrence walked to the bed and squatted down, looking at Peter's right foot. I saw that his right big toe was deformed, and there was a prominent protrusion in the middle of the joint, which was as big as a pigeon egg. This was the so-called gout stone. Lawrence observed for a while, stood up and said solemnly, "Please forgive my remarks, sir, but your condition is indeed more serious than you thought." Peter waved his hand and said indifferently, "Of course I know whether my disease is serious or not. I just ask if you have any solution." "Yes," Lawrence said firmly. "Really? That's right, then." Peter nodded, slightly satisfied after hearing Lawrence's answer, and was about to continue, but Peter's face suddenly twisted, and beads of sweat appeared on his forehead in an instant, and the words he said stopped abruptly. Peter, who had just sat up, fell directly on the bed without any struggle, clenched his teeth tightly, and said in a lost voice, "Damn it, it's here again." Lawrence was also shocked at first, but soon calmed down, knowing that Peter was suffering from acute gout again. The name gout comes from its characteristics. It comes quickly and goes away quickly. Lawrence turned around and patted Paulie, who was still standing there in a daze, and said quickly, "Governor, I will go to prepare the medicine for Mr. Peter now. You go to the cellar to get some ice to apply to Mr. Peter." Chapter 84 Treatment, Part 2. Lord Bonaparte, cough cough, a servant from the governor's mansion, came to Lawrence in the back kitchen of the restaurant with a full cloth bag and said breathlessly, "Everything you want has been collected. I just found it from the market." Lawrence nodded, added a handful of firewood to the kitchen stove, put the iron pot on it to preheat it, and then took the cloth bag from the servant, indicating that he could leave. The cloth bag was filled with roots, stems, leaves and other small items of various plants, and Lawrence patiently searched for a while, and found the only material he needed, the bulb of colchicum. To be precise, Lawrence needed colchicine and the bulb. Colchicine is also known as colchicine. Although this organic substance is highly toxic, it has been found in clinical medicine in later generations to have an excellent analgesic effect on acute gout. Under the current crude conditions, Lawrence could not count on those organic synthetic analgesics, so he could only find a way to extract this natural organic matter from colchicum. As for the other plants in the bag, Lawrence requested them in order to confuse Pete. In this way, Pete could not know from the raw materials where this painkiller with excellent effects came from. Looking around the utensils in the kitchen, Lawrence began to look for suitable extraction tools helplessly. Limited by the current environment, it was a pipe dream to extract high purity colchicine, so Lawrence had to use the simplest water extraction method. Cut the colchicum bulbs into powder and soak them in water. Lawrence then filtered out the powder with gauze, sprinkled a handful of wood ash into the solution to form an alkaline environment, and then filtered it again. Next, an organic solvent was needed for extraction. Lawrence searched the kitchen again, but there was really no way, so he had to scoop a spoonful of lard as an extractant. After separating the oil and water, Lawrence finally poured the lard dissolved with various organic substances into a hot pot for evaporation. Cough, cough, cough. Finally, Lawrence endured the discomfort of being burned by the fumes, put the iron pot aside to cool, and then carefully scraped off a lump of white powder stained with oil from the bottom of the pot. High purity colchicine should be flocculent crystals, and it is unknown how many impurities are contained in this lump of powder in front of him. But Lawrence didn't care. After Pete drank these things, as long as he could suppress the pain of gout. As for whether there would be other health problems in the future, it had nothing to do with Lawrence. Dong dong dong. Several anxious knocks on the door suddenly sounded. Hey, Lawrence. Cough. Have you finished your medicine? Governor Paulie pushed the door in impatiently and was immediately choked by the fumes in the room. He asked while coughing and holding his throat. Lawrence nodded, carefully poured the extracted powder into a wooden cup, and replied, "It's fine now. How is Sir Peter? It has recurred several times in the past hour, and I can't feel it even after applying ice." Paul said worriedly, "There is no time to lose. I will give Sir Peter the medicine now." Lawrence said solemnly, and casually messed up the messy materials on the table, making it impossible to tell what was used, and then left the kitchen with Paul. When Lawrence saw Peter again in the original room, he was exhausted and lying on the sweat-stained bedsheet. Peter's right foot had almost lost its blood color, which was frostbite caused by long-term use of ice cubes to relieve pain. Even though the soles of his feet were numb from the cold, the pain caused by gout was still not much relieved. Peter lay on the bed with a distorted face, rolling and struggling from side to side without caring about his face. After Lawrence entered the room, he immediately took out a small glass from the cupboard, then carefully poured a small layer of the prepared solution into the glass and handed it to Pete. Colchicine is a highly toxic substance after all. Once it is overdosed, the consequences will be disastrous. Lawrence was not sure about the purity of the powder, so he had to let Pete take a small amount of solution at a time, and continue to take it after there is no abnormal reaction. "Sir Pete, please take the medicine. If you have any discomfort in your abdomen, please tell me immediately." The weak Pete stretched out his trembling right hand to take the glass, and reluctantly looked at the liquid inside that looked like clear water, and drank it without hesitation. Lawrence squatted at the head of the bed, silently watching Pete's reaction. The atmosphere in the room was as dull as if it had solidified. Paulie stood at the door with a nervous look, staring at Pete on the sickbed. Even Captain Mosley, who learned that Lawrence had prepared a potion for Sir Pete, ran into the room curiously and worriedly, frowning at the transparent liquid in Lawrence's hand. 10 minutes of suffocating time passed, and Lawrence poured several cups of solution for Pete and handed them to him to drink. But just after Pete drank the 5th cup, the situation suddenly changed. Pete just put down the glass, and his whole body paused for a moment. Then his eyes widened, staring blankly at the front, and he couldn't help but groan twice. "Sir Pete!" Paulie and Captain Morris shouted in unison, and rushed to Pete's bed to support him before the words fell. However, Pete slowly pushed away the two people who came to support him, and his expression had not recovered from his loss of consciousness. He murmured, "My feet are almost not painful, only my stomach is still a little uncomfortable." What? A perfect version in 1619 book bar. Paulie and Captain Morris couldn't help but turn their heads to look at Lawrence. Neither of them thought that those few small cups of water-like things could actually solve Pete's pain for so many years. Exclamation mark. Even the servants in the house came over after hearing the noise. When they saw that Peter, who was struggling on the bed just now, was now sitting on the bed with a relaxed expression, they opened their mouths wide in disbelief. Some servants who had served Peter since childhood could not help but burst into tears. You Your name is Lawrence, right young man? Peter excitedly grabbed Lawrence's hand and said with a bright smile, what kind of potion is this? God, I can hardly feel the pain. What is its formula? Dear Lawrence, I'm willing to exchange it for a mountain of gold. Lawrence stood up slowly, with a secret smile on his lips. He bowed with full apology and said, Dear Sir Peter, for your health, I'm even willing to offer this formula to you free of charge. But, just what? Tell me, young man. Peter waved his hand nonchalantly, motioning Lawrence to continue. It's just that the preparation method and process of this potion are extremely complicated. Lawrence said with regret, even if I give you the formula, a beginner will not be able to prepare the potion correctly, and once there is any mistake in the preparation, the final product will become a deadly poison. After hearing this, Peter's face immediately became disappointed, and then he turned his head to look at the potion in the wooden cup. According to his frequency of illness, the remaining potion would not last for a few days. Seeing that Peter was lost in thought, Lawrence immediately added indirectly, in addition, Sir Peter, this potion can only suppress your pain, and it has no therapeutic effect. If you want to delay the disease, you have to start with the details of your living habits. The implication of this sentence is already very clear. If you want to cure the disease, you have to change your habits in all aspects. As for how to change it, Peter can only know it if Lawrence accompanies him. Peter raised his head suddenly and asked, Are you very knowledgeable about this disease? Of course. Lawrence smiled and answered confidently. Is that so? Peter let out a long breath, looked at his deformed toes, then turned his gaze to Paulie, and said in a deep voice, Paulie, this young man is your subordinate, right? My old bones seem to need some conditioning. What do you think? Although this was a request for Paulie's opinion, there was no room for Paulie to refuse in Peter's tone. Haha, of course no problem, Sir Peter. Paulie gritted his teeth secretly, glanced at Lawrence, but on the surface he still forced out a polite smile and nodded repeatedly. Chapter 85 Meeting. How is your health, Sir Pitt? Lawrence walked into Pitt's mansion, skillfully took off his coat with the help of the servant, and hung it on the hanger, then walked into the living room, and greeted Pitt who was drinking afternoon tea. After successfully relieving Pitt's pain with colchicine that day, Lawrence was asked by Pitt to come to his residence every afternoon for auxiliary treatment. Governor Paulie was of course extremely resistant to this. He had been trying his best to keep Lawrence away from the governor's mansion in the past 2 years, but now, he could only feel unhappy in his heart. This was the first time in all these years that Pitt had hope of curing his illness. Not to mention Paulie, even if the king wanted to stop it, Pitt would not agree. A week passed in a flash. During this period, Lawrence also took this opportunity to make friends with Pitt as much as possible, preparing to get the content of the meeting with Paulie from him. Ah, Lawrence, tea, or coffee? When Pitt saw that it was Lawrence, his smile became even brighter. He warmly asked him to sit down, and asked the servant to bring a set of tea sets. Coffee is fine. Good afternoon, Sir Pitt, how are you? Lawrence also bowed to Pitt with a faint smile, and asked him, while sitting opposite him. Hearing this question, even William Pitt, who was known for his coldness and arbitrariness, couldn't help showing a slightly excited look. He said with satisfaction, I have indeed gotten better recently. The number of attacks has decreased a little, and the pain seems to have eased a little. It's just that I'm about to vomit eating only those vegetables every day. This is also for your health, Sir Pitt. I salute your health. Lawrence took the teacup from the servant and offered it to Pitt. Pitt nodded and looked at Lawrence with a smile. After a week of getting along with this young man, Pitt also began to appreciate and admire Lawrence, especially after sending people to inquire about Lawrence's deeds. Pitt was very surprised that Lawrence had such a high reputation and status in the hearts of the people of Ajaccio and the soldiers of the army. Lawrence, I have to admit that you are a very good young man. Pitt took a sip of hot tea and suddenly said to Lawrence, if my 11-year-old son can be like you in the future, I will be much more relieved. You are joking. The young master will definitely be as outstanding as you in the future. Lawrence was stunned for a moment and said with a smile. This was not because Lawrence was modest, but because William Pitt's son, William Pitt the Younger, was the youngest prime minister in Britain in history, and he was not inferior to Napoleon in the game. However, Pitt's sudden praise made Lawrence a little strange, and he believed that Pitt must have something to say to him. Sure enough, Pitt gently put down the teacup, exhaled a breath of hot air, and suddenly said, "By the way, it's a waste of talent for a young man like you to stay in Corsica. Do you want to go to London?" Lawrence raised his eyebrows and listened calmly to Pitt's olive branch to him, without being too excited. Lawrence knew very well that Pitt invited him to go back to London with him, mainly because he saw that he could cure his gout. As for the appreciation of his ability, it was just a common courtesy among politicians. Seeing that Lawrence was not moved at all, Pitt frowned slightly and then said, "Dear Lawrence, you may not imagine that the slums in the east city of London alone are several times larger than the entire Ajaccio. I, an old man, still have some face in London. If you follow me, you may even have a chance to meet the king." Lawrence listened silently, playing with the teacup in his hand, and did not take Pitt's pie in the sky seriously. In fact, Pitt's pie in the sky skills were not as good as Lawrence's boss in his previous life. Although Pitt's words were very tempting, Lawrence knew very well that Pitt's loss of power in British politics was a foregone conclusion. If he really went to London with him, he would basically be a private doctor for the rest of his life. Even if William Pitt the Younger would become the future Prime Minister, that would be 13 years later in history. "I'm sorry, Sir Pitt." Lawrence sighed deeply and said regretfully, "My relatives and friends, my loyal subordinates, and the people who have high hopes for me are all in Corsica, so please allow me to refuse your invitation." "Is that so?" Pitt nodded slowly, then suddenly waved his hand and said, "That's not a problem. It will be very convenient for you to return to Corsica in the future, or it will be easy for Corsicans to move to England." Huh. Lawrence was slightly startled, and his brain immediately began to capture the key information in this sentence instinctively. Will it be very convenient to return to Corsica? Nowadays, merchant ships traveling between Corsica and England are not frequent, and you can only see one every 1 or 2 months. According to Pitt, it seems that something will change in the future. Besides, would it be easy for Corsicans to move to England? Such a large-scale immigration must have been approved by the government, which means that Paulie and Peter should have reached a relevant agreement. Increasing trade and opening up immigration. Just from these 2 points, the relationship between England and Corsica will become very close. Lawrence frowned, lowered his head to analyze, and had a bad premonition. Even if it goes a step further than intimacy, then a perfect version in 16-9 book bar. Ahem. Lawrence? Peter looked at Lawrence, who was lost in thought, coughed twice, interrupted Lawrence in a strange way and said, "What's wrong? Is there a problem?" "Haha, nothing, just a little curious. After all, there are not many ships on the route from London to Corsica, and it's not that easy for Corsicans to move to England." Lawrence chuckled and shook his head, and then continued to speak tentatively. Peter opened his mouth and was about to say something. One of Pitt's attendants led a man into the living room and interrupted Pitt's words. Lawrence turned his head and found that the man following the attendant was Paula's secretary. "Mr. Pitt." The secretary stepped forward, bowed very respectfully, and said to Pitt in not very fluent English, "Your meeting with Governor Paulie is about to begin. Please prepare to enter. The venue is still in the auditorium of the governor's mansion." Pitt sighed slightly and shrugged helplessly at Lawrence, as if he was a little regretful for not explaining it clearly to Lawrence. However, Pete immediately sat in his seat for a moment, as if thinking about something, then nodded to himself, smiled and said to Lawrence, "Young man, you will soon know why." After that, Pete stood up, nodded coldly to the secretary and said, "I know." Just when the secretary thought the announcement was over and was about to leave, Pete glanced at Lawrence in front of him again, suddenly stopped the secretary and said, "Wait. Do you have any other instructions?" The secretary hurriedly stopped and turned around to ask. Pete pointed at Lawrence in his seat and said slowly in an undeniable tone, "Tell Pasquale Paoli to give Lawrence Bonaparte a seat. I want him to attend the meeting too. Thanks to bookfriend 2020051019172375 for the monthly ticket support, and Zio for the reward. Thank you." Chapter 86. You are committing treason, Governor. The meeting place between Paulie and Pete was in the auditorium, where the parliament was held. However, unlike the parliament which was open to everyone, the meeting between Paulie and Pete was highly confidential. Even the time of the meeting was not announced to the participants until half an hour before the meeting. In order to prevent eavesdropping and peeping, the doors and windows of the huge auditorium were closed, making the interior dark. The only light source was a few candlesticks on the table. There were not many participants from both sides. They sat on both sides of the horseshoe-shaped long table. During the time waiting for the meeting to start, no one whispered to each other. The meeting place was silent. Although his seat was requested by Pete, Lawrence still knew where to sit. After entering the auditorium, Lawrence parted ways with Pete and sat on Paulie's side without feeling embarrassed. Paulie was expressionless, as if he had not seen Lawrence. He just lowered his head and flipped through the minutes in his hand, but he didn't know if he could see clearly in such light. Sitting in his seat, Lawrence had recovered from the surprise that Pete had just asked him to sit at the meeting. I guess their meeting is almost over, and Pete really wants me to go back to London with him, so he made an exception and gave me this treatment. Lawrence looked at the participants and wondered what Pete meant. There were only 5 or 6 people sitting on each side of the horseshoe-shaped long table. Except for Paulie and Pete, they were all clerks and recorders. It's almost time. The secretary sitting next to Paulie looked at his pocket watch and reminded him softly. Paulie nodded, took the meeting documents from the secretary, cleared his throat, and said seriously, "Good afternoon, Mr. Pitt. Our main agreement has been reached, and only some details need to be improved." "Well, let me see." Pitt moved a candlestick closer to himself, put on his glasses, and looked through the documents, and said, "The next item is how to deal with the upper class after Corsica is annexed to England." Pitt's voice echoed in the empty auditorium. The shadows of the participants swayed in the candlelight, and the oppressive and solemn atmosphere filled the whole venue. The faces of each participant were blurred in the shadows, but Pitt's voice was real and clear to Lawrence's ears. "Corsica is annexed to England." The venue fell into a brief silence. After Pitt finished reading this sentence, he did not say anything, and glanced at Lawrence meaningfully. Paulie also observed Lawrence's expression with the corner of his eye. Lawrence, on the other hand, just pretended not to hear anything, and did not move at all, still sitting upright in his seat. The whistling evening wind outside the auditorium slammed violently against the closed doors and windows, and the clanging noise echoed inside. Paulie took a deep breath, turned his eyes away from Lawrence, looked at his materials, and said in a deep voice, "So, Mr. Pitt, what do you think about this issue? I can promise here that the senior officials of the Corsican government, including you, will remain in their original positions. Of course, the new government needs to have British people joining, and the proportion must reach 20%, Pitt said slowly. "No problem." Paulie nodded and exchanged glances with Pitt. They both signaled their clerks to record the treaty and make rigorous legal revisions after the meeting. "By the way," Paulie lowered his voice and asked eagerly, "what about the issue of awarding honors?" Pete glanced at Paulie and said slowly, "You will be awarded the title of Count of Corsica. If the cabinet and His Majesty the King attach enough importance to Corsica, you may be awarded the title of Duke of Corsica." "Very good, very good, very good." Paulie nodded. His eyes became a little stagnant, and he stopped after saying "very good" 3 times. "Oh, by the way," Pete interrupted Paulie's excitement and said seriously, "I personally suggest that Governor Paulie add a name to the list of people applying for honors." "Add a name? Who?" Paulie was stunned for a moment and asked subconsciously. "Lawrence Bonaparte." "Lawrence? Why?" Paulie frowned. If it were someone else who said this, he would have rushed up and punched him. Pitt glanced at Lawrence with a smile and said slowly, "Don't forget, we promised to award honors to certain Corsicans of status in order to avoid unrest during the merger process. To put it bluntly, it is to win over powerful people. I think Mr. Bonaparte meets this condition." Lawrence listened silently and couldn't help sighing, thinking, "Pitt is forcing me with a gift that I don't want at all." The meeting did not last long, because the regulations discussed were indeed mostly minor details, and Pitt and Paulie did not argue too much with each other. A perfect version in 16 to 9 books and bars. As for important matters such as garrisons, trade, tariffs, and immigration, the two had reached an agreement in the previous talks. Although this treaty has not yet been fully released and announced, the day when Corsica will plant the Red Cross flag seems to be not far away. After the meeting, the British on Pitt's side packed up the documents and left directly. Before leaving, Pitt patted Lawrence on the shoulder and said meaningfully, "Reconsider my proposal, British citizen." With the departure of Pitt and his party, as well as the clerk and recorder of the governor's mansion, only Paulie, Lawrence, and Paul as secretary remained in the empty auditorium. Ahem, Governor, the meeting is over. The secretary looked at the two people sitting there awkwardly and reminded them. Paulie rested his arms on the table, supported his forehead with both hands, closed his eyes, and rubbed his temples, and said softly, "Go to my study, and bring me the recent reports of the Southern Legion." The secretary stood there hesitant for a moment, but still obeyed Paulie's order, and left the auditorium, to get the reports Paulie requested. After the secretary left, Lawrence sighed, closed his eyes, and leaned back in his chair, saying casually, "So, Governor, this is what you want to do? Plant the British flag on Corsica?" The whistling evening breeze poured in from the gate, making Lawrence's back a little cold. Paulie didn't say anything, still rubbing his temples. Lawrence turned his head and looked at Paulie, saying, "Maybe I should call you the Count of Corsica from now on." "That's enough, Lawrence." Paulie opened his eyes, but didn't look at Lawrence, just said in a flat tone, "In my eyes, I'm doing what I have to do." The blood-red sunset shot into the auditorium from the gate, stretching the shadows of Lawrence and Paulie on the ground into two narrow black lines. The two black lines were like two dueling rapiers, about to intersect fiercely. "And in my eyes," Lawrence stood up, his eyes fixed on Paulie's face, and said directly, "You are committing treason, Governor." Chapter 87 Sardinia Invasion. The sound of the wind still echoed throughout the entire auditorium. The manic evening wind swept through, blowing out all the candles on the table, and even some candlesticks were directly overturned to the ground, rolling on the ground, and making a clanging sound. "Treason?" Paul shook his head, sneered disdainfully, and said without even looking at Lawrence, "I'm protecting Corsica, young man. Don't talk about politics." "Protect?" Lawrence couldn't help but put his hands on the table and asked loudly, "This country will no longer exist. Corsica's language, culture, traditions, everything will no longer exist. Our descendants living in London only know that they are British, and don't know that they have a home called Corsica. You call this protection?" The echo kept refracting and reflecting, and it came into Paul's ears over and over again, but Paul just shook his head indifferently and said, "Wait a minute, you will see something, and you will understand." About a few minutes later, Paul's secretary returned to the auditorium with a large volume of documents. After putting the documents on the table, he left very tactfully. "Take a look." Paulie pushed the pile of documents in front of Lawrence, and after saying this, he closed his eyes and rested. Lawrence frowned and opened the document. It was written at the top that this was a report of the Southern Corps of the National Defense Force. The reports have been arranged by time. The earliest one was 4 months ago, and the latest one was just delivered a few days ago. In the afterglow before sunset, Lawrence flipped through the reports. When the sun completely set, the auditorium became dark, and the two could only see each other's figures in the moonlight. Lawrence threw the thick book on the table, held his forehead, and took a long breath, and asked in a deep voice, "Is the Kingdom of Sardinia preparing to invade Corsica?" Sardinia is located in the south of Corsica, and is almost connected to Corsica end to end. The two islands are separated by a strait about 10 kilometers wide. The full name of the Kingdom of Sardinia in this era should be the Kingdom of Sardinia Piedmont, because it was the Duke of Piedmont in northwestern Italy who first exchanged Sicily for Sardinia in 1723, and used the legal basis of Sardinia to create the title of the Kingdom of Sardinia and crown himself. Therefore, the base of the Kingdom of Sardinia is not on the poor Sardinia, but in the rich Piedmont in the Po River basin. Even its capital is not in Sardinia, but in Turin, Piedmont. "Yes, do you know this country?" Paulie said, standing up and picking up a candlestick, relighting it and putting it on the table. Lawrence sorted out his memory and analyzed. "Sardinia is nothing to say, but Piedmont is a land of rich water and soil, and it is also the industrial center of northern Italy. The geographical environment is also unique, surrounded by the Alps on 3 sides. Although the territory is not large, the national strength is quite strong. Of course, there is one thing Lawrence did not say, that is, the historical kingdom of Sardinia completed the unification of all of Italy and established the kingdom of Italy almost 90 years ago. Paulie nodded in approval and asked, "Do you think Corsica has a chance of winning?" Lawrence shook his head flatly, turning into a defeatist counselor. "Not at all. They are coming for the silver mines. Corsica, which is rich in minerals, is an excellent complement to the terrain of the Piedmont Plain." Paulie smiled with relief after hearing this, thinking that he had finally convinced Lawrence, and said, "With your intelligence, you can understand that, if the reasonable had not been anchored in Ajaccio, the navy of the Kingdom of Sardinia would have entered the port of Ajaccio long ago." The evening breeze rustled the pages of the book on the table. Paulie crossed his legs, looked at Lawrence, as if he had won the victory, and added, "And you also heard that Lord Pitt has won a title for you, so shut up, and go to London to enjoy your life." However, to Paulie's surprise, Lawrence shook his head slowly and firmly and said, "Excuse me, Governor, you attracted the attention of a lion in order to drive a werewolf. What do you mean?" Paulie was stunned for a moment, and asked with a frown. Lawrence took a deep breath, sorted out his thoughts, and said, "Governor, who hates the British the most?" Paulie answered without hesitation, "The French. The whole world knows it." "Then where is the most important seaport for the British Royal Navy in the Mediterranean?" Lawrence asked immediately. "Well, of course it's Gibraltar." "Lawrence, what do you want to say?" Paulie frowned at Lawrence, after thinking for a while. "Your answer is correct, but it's a pity that it was wrong soon after." Lawrence opened the report of the Southern Corps by candlelight, found a map of the Northern Mediterranean, took it to Paulie and said, "When the British get Corsica, Ajaccio will become their most important naval base in the Mediterranean. Because to the west is Spain and France, to the east is Italy, and to the south is North Africa. They may even use it as a springboard to try to control Egypt, to open up a second route to India. Of course, these are not the most important." Lawrence added, "The most important, and the most fatal to Corsica, is that Ajaccio is only about a day's sailing from Toulon and Marseille in France. The French will not accept these two cities being directly threatened by the Royal Navy." After the voice fell, Paulie fell into silence, and said nothing under the continuous chirping of insects. Read the correct version in 1619 book bar. You also understand, once a war breaks out between Britain and France, Corsica will become the focus of competition between the two sides at the first time, and the consequences of that. Lawrence did not finish his words, but the meaning of his expression was already very clear. The entire Corsica will become a battlefield full of smoke. As long as the historical enemies of Britain and France remain hostile to each other, the Corsicans will always live under the shadow of war. Enough, Lawrence, enough. Paulie squeezed out a sentence with difficulty, waved his hand and said, "This is just your wishful thinking. Since the British will regard Ajaccio as an important naval port, they will also protect Corsica. I don't want to hear these words anymore." Seeing Paulie's stubborn look, Lawrence couldn't help but sigh and shook his head and said, "Governor, if I knew you were going to give Corsica to the British, I wouldn't have spent so much effort to help you get rid of the French threat." "Lawrence, what do you mean?" Paulie was already a little angry, but he didn't tear his face with Lawrence, just for the sake of Pete's face. Lawrence waved his hands, not caring about Paulie's emotions at all, shrugged and said, "At least the French will treat Corsica as a core territory, not just a large port like the British. Historically, Corsica has been synonymous with poverty since it was incorporated into France. The per capita GDP here is 30% lower than that of the French, but it also receives huge financial subsidies. During the French Directory period, the annual subsidy to Corsica was as high as 11.4 billion francs. Even in the 21st century of Lawrence's previous life, the French government still provided high financial subsidies to the province of Corsica every year." Boom. Paulie slammed his fist on the table, and the loud noise crossed the lonely night sky, startling a flock of birds roosting in the garden. "Shut up. Lawrence, you can leave now. In addition, I'll give you a saying that Corsicans often say, don't try to resist the tide." Lawrence stood up silently and walked out of the auditorium without looking back. Paulie was so angry that he was shaking all over, staring at Lawrence's back in a perplexed manner as he slowly disappeared into the darkness under the moonlight. It was not until he left the governor's mansion that Lawrence looked up at the clear night sky and muttered to himself, Genoa, Sardinia, Corsica, England, this island has become the fuse of a powder keg. In this case, it might as well make the scene more chaotic. Having made up his mind, Lawrence's eyes became firm again, and he looked towards the northwest sky, in the direction of France. Chapter 88. Lure the tiger away from the mountain. The next morning, in East District. Hey, Lieutenant Colonel Bonaparte, long time no see. Lawrence was walking on the way to the governor's mansion when he suddenly heard someone calling him from behind. He turned around and found that it was Major Tripoli. Good morning, Major. It's been a long time since we last met. Lawrence turned around and saluted Tripoli, saying hello with some surprise. However, Major Tripoli's dress made Lawrence very strange. He was not wearing casual clothes, but a full set of military uniforms, and even wore the medal he received 2 years ago on his chest. Moreover, judging from the direction Major Tripoli was walking, it seemed that he was also rushing to the governor's mansion. Have you also received a summons from the governor? Lawrence asked with a frown. After parting with Paulie last night, Lawrence thought he would be squeezed out of the governor's mansion for a while. But he didn't expect that early this morning. Lawrence received an order from Paulie to summon him, and emphasized that he would go immediately. Yes, Lieutenant Colonel, you too? Major Tripoli scratched his chin, and felt something was wrong. What happened that made Paulie call them together again? Just as the two chatted for a while, another man in military uniform ran towards them from a distance, shouting excitedly, "Hi, sir." Both sirs. Lawrence and Tripoli looked closely and found that this man was actually Lieutenant Set, the former commander of the 4th Battalion and Lawrence's former subordinate. Lawrence took a quick look at Lieutenant Set. Like Major Tripoli, he was wearing a full set of military uniforms and wore the battle hero medal he won 2 years ago on his chest. Lieutenant Colonel Bonaparte, I didn't expect to see you here. Lieutenant Set hadn't seen Lawrence since he left the Northern Corps. At this moment, he actually met Lawrence and Tripoli on the road at the same time, which made Lieutenant Set excited. Lawrence nodded to Set. Although he had no reason to visit the soldiers of the former 4th Battalion, after returning to Ajaccio, he never stopped exchanging letters with them. How have you been recently? How are the brothers of the 4th Battalion? Lawrence asked Lieutenant Set casually. That's great. Although our organization has been disbanded, no matter where the soldiers of the 4th Battalion go, someone will whisper behind their backs, "Look, those are the soldiers returning triumphantly from the Gulf of Eiffel." Set gestured with a beaming face and said excitedly, "Not to mention the gold coins you sent us last time. When our soldiers opened the package, my god, it's a pity that you didn't see the other soldiers' jaws drop." Lawrence kept smiling and listened, patiently waiting for Lieutenant Set to finish his exaggerated story, and then asked, "By the way, how did you get back to Ajaccio?" Hearing this question, Lieutenant Set's face showed some hesitation. He looked around carefully, and after making sure there were no other pedestrians, he whispered, "We were urgently transferred back to Ajaccio from the Northern Corps. We just arrived last night. There are several hundred people in this secret transfer. It is said that a special dispatch battalion has been formed." Lawrence frowned and asked repeatedly, "Emergency transfer? Wait, are you going to the governor's palace too?" "That's right. I received an order from General Paulie." "The two officers too?" Lieutenant Set replied in confusion. Lawrence and Tripoli frowned and looked at each other. It was definitely not a coincidence that the 3 officers and non-commissioned officers of the former 4th Battalion were summoned at the same time. "Lieutenant Colonel Bonaparte, General Paulie must have summoned the 3 of us on purpose. What does he want to do?" Major Tripoli looked embarrassed and asked Lawrence. Lawrence took a deep breath and vaguely guessed that Paulie's behavior would be related to him, so he didn't say anything and directly motioned for the 2 to follow him to the governor's mansion. "Ah, 3 Corsican warriors, welcome. Please sit down." Paulie was still meeting the 3 in the study. After seeing the 3 enter, Paulie just made a welcoming gesture and asked the 3 to sit down in a flat tone. There was no expression on his face, especially when facing Lawrence, as if the quarrel last night had never happened. "First, I need you to finish reading this," Paulie said, pushing a stack of documents on the desk in front of the 3 people. Lawrence glanced at it. This was the report of the Southern Corps of the National Defense Force that Paulie showed him last night, so he picked it up and flipped through it casually without reading it carefully. However, when Major Tripoli and Lieutenant Set passed the report around, they both couldn't help but reveal their expressions of shock and panic. Major Tripoli couldn't help but ask, "General, the Kingdom of Sardinia will launch an attack on Corsica?" Although Lieutenant Set didn't say anything, his wide open mouth had already expressed his shock. Paulie nodded, without looking at Lawrence, and said directly, "There are about 3,000 troops attacking directly north from Sardinia. The main force of the Kingdom of Sardinia is still in Piedmont. The number of people is unknown, and they are preparing to cross the sea to land in Corsica." A correct version at 1619 book bar. The study was suddenly surrounded by a silent atmosphere. Major Tripoli and Lieutenant Set both knew that the attack of the Kingdom of Sardinia was not something the Corsican defense forces could resist head-on. In the worst case, they would even have to consider withdrawing from the city and entering the mountains and forests to start guerrilla resistance. Although Lawrence knew that Paulie had found the British as a backing, he did not point it out in front of the two. After all, this matter was still a confidential matter, and Lawrence also wanted to see what tricks Paulie played by gathering the three people. Seeing that the three people on the opposite side did not speak, Paulie said to himself, "Now, the top priority is to resist the attack launched from Sardinia. I have already drawn troops from the Northern Legion to reinforce the south. Lieutenant Set should know this." Lieutenant Set was stunned for a moment, and then nodded quickly. He was already a little nervous facing the Supreme Commander Paulie, and he was even more stunned after hearing the news of the Sardinian invasion. It was inevitable that he was a little absent-minded. This is a battle that determines the life and death of Corsica. 3 soldiers. Paulie suddenly raised his voice and said loudly, "You completed the impossible task in Bastia 2 years ago. Now, I hope that your courage and wisdom can bring victory to Corsica again. I hereby appoint Lieutenant Colonel Bonaparte as the commander of this special mission battalion, and Major Tripoli and Lieutenant Set will serve as his adjutants to go to the southern theater to support the battle." Paulie's passionate voice echoed in the study and immediately infected Major Tripoli and Lieutenant Set. "Yes." The two immediately stood up excitedly, saluted and answered loudly. Lawrence's action was half a beat slower. After standing up, he did not speak, but saluted to indicate that he accepted the appointment. After a series of handover procedures, the three left the governor's mansion together and immediately set off for the troop station, preparing to march to the south immediately. "Oh my god, General Paulie actually trusts me so much," Lieutenant Set said excitedly as he walked on the road. Although Major Cui Fally was not so excited, he was also infected by Paulie's words and said, "This is indeed a difficult task, but it is also a great honor and affirmation of us." Lawrence walked in front of the two without saying a word. When Paulie said that he would appoint him as the commander of the special battalion to reinforce the southern region, Lawrence understood the intention of this old fox. This was to transfer him away from Ajaccio at the critical time of the contract signing to avoid any accidents. In addition, even with Lawrence's special battalion, the garrison in the southern region only had about 1,000 people. Facing the attack of the enemy with better equipment and superior numbers, it can be said that there is no chance of winning. As long as Lawrence suffered a defeat in the south, Paulie could take advantage of the situation to suppress Lawrence's reputation in the army and hold Lawrence accountable for his command according to military law. It's just that behind every risk there is an opportunity. If I can return triumphantly from the south, Pasquale Paoli, how ugly will you look? Lawrence looked ahead with grim eyes, knowing that it was time to reveal the trump card in his hand. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 89, Heading South, Part 1. By the way, Lieutenant Set, go to the task force and tell the soldiers to get ready to go. Lawrence suddenly stopped walking on the road, turned around and told Lieutenant Set, "I have something to do with Major Tripoli." "Yes, I understand," Lieutenant Set answered competently. He also knew that his status was still incomparable to that of Major Tripoli, so he saluted briefly and then quickened his pace and left. When Lieutenant Set's figure completely disappeared, Lawrence pulled Major Tripoli and whispered, "Major, how are those rifles?" 2 years ago, Lawrence asked Major Tripoli for 10 test rifles and distributed them to the most loyal patrolmen for testing. Lawrence also summarized the various problems that arose during the test and reported them to Major Tripoli regularly to help him make further improvements. Hearing Lawrence asking about this revolutionary new weapon, Major Tripoli immediately became serious and whispered, "It has been improved a lot compared to the original prototype, but it is not enough to be used as a standard weapon. Its service life has not been fully measured, and the manufacturing process is also." Stop, stop, stop. Lawrence quickly stopped Major Tripoli and frowned and said, "I don't want to know the details of the engineering. I just want to know if it can shoot lead bullets into the hearts of the Sardinians now. Lieutenant Colonel Bonaparte, do you want to use the rifle in this battle?" Hearing Lawrence's request, Major Tripoli was immediately excited and asked repeatedly. As one of the creators of the rifle, Major Tripoli was looking forward to its performance on the real battlefield. He also looked forward to his name being spread throughout Europe in the future with this gun. However, after thinking for a moment, Major Tripoli's excitement faded a little, and he sighed and said, "But now I only have a dozen rifles, all for testing. Even if you add the 10 rifles you have, I'm afraid they will be of little use on the battlefield." According to Lawrence's request, Major Tripoli always kept the existence of the rifle as the biggest secret and never revealed it to anyone else. But the disadvantage is that Major Tripoli doesn't even have an assistant. He relies on himself to complete the entire process from forging parts to assembly, which makes the output of rifles really pitiful. Not to mention that he is also responsible for the improvement and design of the rifles as well as his own work. If there is still a requirement for sufficient output under such a workload, even capitalists would cry. Let's not talk about the quantity first. How is the shooting quality? Lawrence asked indifferently. He also knew that the number of these guns would not be large. The accuracy is much better than at the beginning. Now we can achieve accurate shooting at a distance of 200 yards. Major Tripoli answered skillfully. 200 yards is about 180 meters. Although such an effective range is far less than that of later rifles, it is a huge leap for the current smoothbore guns. Lawrence lowered his head and pondered something. After a moment, he nodded to himself, as if he had made up his mind, and ordered, 200 yards is enough. Major, you go and send someone to bring all these rifles, including the ones from the patrol. Okay, I'll go now. Major Cui Farley hesitated for a moment, but still nodded helplessly in agreement, although he felt that these 20-odd guns would not have any impact on the battle situation. Only Lawrence knew that the role of these 20-odd guns was not to kill more enemy soldiers on the battlefield. Their role was to bring a tactical dimensionality reduction strike to the outdated line warfare method of queuing and shooting. About an hour later, on the outskirts of Ajaccio, the special battalion drawn from the Northern Legion was stationed here. "Sir, you are here." Lieutenant Set saluted when he saw Lawrence and Tripoli coming to the camp. Following Lawrence, in addition to several orderly soldiers carrying guns and ammunition, there were 10 patrolmen accompanying him. These 10 people were also the earliest users of rifles. In 2 years of testing, they were already very proficient in the use of rifles. And in Lawrence's plan, they will play an indelible role. Lawrence nodded slightly and glanced at the camp. The soldiers were already lined up and looking at Lawrence with expectation and admiration. The backpacks, sleeping bags and blankets were also packed and ready to go at any time. However, when Lawrence's eyes swept over the faces of these soldiers, he felt something was wrong. There were really a lot of familiar faces here, and Lawrence had impressions of many of them. They should be soldiers from the original 4th Battalion. "Lieutenant, how many soldiers are here?" Lawrence frowned and asked Lieutenant Set beside him. "We've counted them, 430 people. There seem to be a lot of familiar faces among them. Check out the correct version on the 16-9 book forum. Isn't that right, sir?" Lieutenant Seth didn't know the relationship between Lawrence and Paulie after all, so he didn't feel anything unusual. Instead, he said happily, "The brothers of the 4th Battalion are basically here. It's like our organization is back." It's really rare to feel like fighting side by side. However, Lawrence ignored Lieutenant Seth's smile, but took a deep breath, and then slowly exhaled. Then Lawrence looked at the soldiers in front of him, and turned his head to glance at Major Trefali and Lieutenant Seth beside him. Damn Paulie. Lawrence frowned, cursing in his heart, thinking silently, no wonder Major Trefali and Lieutenant Seth were summoned. Paulie, is this to push the entire 4th Battalion into the fire pit? And it doesn't matter if so many soldiers' lives are sacrificed. After seeing these old subordinates in front of him, Lawrence understood Paulie's complete intention. This is to uproot his influence in the military. As for the so-called reinforcement of the South, it is just a rhetoric. In Paulie's eyes, it doesn't matter whether the Southern Corps can resist the attack of the Kingdom of Sardinia. He has already sought protection from Britain. The only purpose of sending this task force is to let the soldiers of Lawrence's 4th Battalion go to die, and even Lawrence himself can die on the battlefield. For this purpose, Paulie would not hesitate to let the soldiers of the entire Southern Corps be buried with him. As long as the 4th Battalion suffers heavy casualties, Lawrence's foundation in the army will be lost, and if Paulie continues to add fuel to the flames in secret, Lawrence's influence in the army will soon dissipate, leaving only a false name. Paulie may not even let Lawrence keep a false name. What a bastard. Lawrence suddenly punched the tree trunk beside him in anger, and whispered in a voice that only he could hear, "These soldiers went through fire and water for the ideals he preached, but he held their hearts in his hands and crushed them, and scattered them like dust, all just to satisfy his perverted desire for power." Pasquale Paulie, I wanted to give you a good end. Thanks to the book friend Elio Shubinu for the reward and monthly ticket. I also wish you all a happy Mid-Autumn Festival, and if there are book friends who are teachers, I also wish you a happy Teachers' Day HH. Chapter 90, Going South, Part 2. 1770, Bonifacio, the southernmost city in Corsica. This is a small city standing on a high and narrow cape. The city has a steep terrain, and is surrounded by the sea on 3 sides, and 2 of them are cliffs dozens of meters above the sea. Only the flatter terrain in the north can allow small ships to dock. When Lawrence led the special battalion here, he couldn't help but sigh that this is indeed a natural fortress that is easy to defend and difficult to attack. No wonder the Southern Army chose to station here. After completing the handover procedures with the local garrison, Lawrence, with Major Trefali and Lieutenant Seth, met the commander of the Southern Army, Colonel Silva, in an ancient fortress that has been weathered at the highest point of Bonifacio. Welcome, Lieutenant Colonel Bonaparte, who has come from afar, and to others. Please take a seat. Colonel Silva seemed to be flipping through some letters. When he saw Lawrence come in, his expression even showed a moment of panic. After putting the letter away, he stood up and greeted the 3 people. Lawrence nodded, pulled out a creaking chair and sat down, looking up and looking around. This is the top floor of the fortress, but it has obviously not been repaired for a long time, and moss can be seen everywhere in the room. The sea breeze keeps coming in through the cracks in the stone bricks, bringing salty and humid water vapor, and sometimes when it blows through some small cracks of the right size, it will make a very high-pitched humming sound. The sound insulation effect is also very poor, and the endless sound of waves and the noisy cries of seagulls are almost unobstructed. Sometimes they can even cover the sound of conversation. The environment here is obviously much worse than the longhouse of General Bastieri Nason at that time. Colonel, please introduce the situation here to me. After taking a seat, Lawrence didn't waste any words, and went straight to the point. The day when Paulie and Pete reach a final agreement will not be too far away, and Lawrence doesn't have much time to waste in the south. Colonel Silva moved his chair, got closer to Lawrence, and said, "The situation in Bonifacio is not optimistic now. As you know, this is the southernmost city, across the sea from Sardinia. The enemy's first target on Sardinia must be here." Lawrence turned his head, and looked at the map of Bonifacio hanging on the wall, and said tentatively, "But in my opinion, the terrain of this city is very favorable to us. Our 1,000-man garrison occupies the natural barrier, and can hold on for a long time." In fact, Lawrence had no intention of stationing in Bonifacio. He said this just to confirm whether his guess about Paulie's intention was correct. Sure enough, Colonel Silva was stunned for a moment, and his eyes moved around aimlessly, as if he was thinking about something to say. Ahem, Lieutenant Colonel Bonaparte, your opinion makes sense, but Colonel Silver touched his chin and said in a serious tone, what if this enemy army gives up the siege on us and goes all the way north to Ajaccio? This will directly threaten the heart of Corsica. Lawrence listened carefully on the surface, but he already knew in his heart that Paulie had indeed sent him and the soldiers of the 4th Battalion to die. Even an outsider like Lawrence, who had not received formal military training, could see that in this situation, defending the city was the best and only choice. And Colonel Silver's words undoubtedly made Lawrence give up the idea of defending the city and take the initiative to attack. So, what do you mean? Lawrence knew that it was useless to argue with Colonel Silver. Paulie probably gave him a death order, so he went straight to Colonel Silver's words. I think our army must intercept this enemy in Bonifacio. To do this, we may need more radical means, even if it will cost us something. Seeing that Lawrence did not argue with him, Colonel Silver's expression suddenly relaxed a lot, and he directly stated his policy in one breath. The sound of waves hitting the table and seabirds chirping continued to come into the room, and because no one spoke anymore, it seemed even more noisy. It was not until half a minute later that Major Trifle recovered from his surprise. He stood up with a frown and said anxiously, radical means? Colonel Silver, as far as I know, our army is inferior to the enemy in quality and quantity. How can we adopt a radical posture? Lieutenant Set was not able to stand up and speak because of his low rank, but he had the same idea as Major Trifle and nodded in agreement. TSK. Colonel Silver smacked his lips in dissatisfaction and looked at Trifle and sternly rebuked, Major Trifle, as a soldier, I hope you will obey rather than question. Please remember, I'm the commander of the Southern Corps. You only need to accept my orders and execute them. Lawrence held his forehead and glanced at Colonel Silver. It was obvious that he was not speaking to Major Trifle alone. So, Lawrence turned around and winked at Major Trifle, asking him to sit down. Then he looked at Colonel Silver and asked in a deep voice, I want to ask you a question. Are these policies your own, or were they issued by General Paulie? What's the difference? Colonel Silver shook his head and did not want to answer this question. Of course. Lawrence deliberately put on a more unrestrained attitude, leaning back on the chair with his legs crossed, looking down at Colonel Silver and said, I'm sorry to say that I don't agree with your policy. As the commander of the Special Mission Battalion, I have the right to refuse to obey. But if this is General Paulie's order, even if I don't understand it personally, I must obey it. You. Colonel Silver was embarrassed, not knowing what tricks Lawrence was playing. After hesitating for a moment, he said, okay, I tell you, this is General Paulie's order, but the order document is confidential, and I can't confirm it for you. Very good. In this case, I will act according to the policy just now. A correct version in the 1619 book bar. To Colonel Silver's surprise, Lawrence did not ask to see Paulie's secret letter at all. He just said goodbye to him after saying this, and left with Major Trifale and Lieutenant Set without looking back. Until the footsteps of Lawrence and the other two disappeared in the fortress, Colonel Silver still didn't figure out what Lawrence wanted to do by asking this question. This Lieutenant Colonel Bonaparte, did he realize that General Paulie was targeting him, but he only got verbal confirmation from me. I could have deceived him to make him obey orders. He couldn't have been unaware of this. Colonel Silver touched his chin and thought for a long time, but he didn't understand what Lawrence meant by asking this question. Of course, what Colonel Silver didn't know was that Lawrence didn't want to confirm from him whether Paulie was targeting him. His last question was not for himself, but for the two people behind him, Major Trifale and Lieutenant Set. So, do you understand everything? In the station of the Special Mission Battalion, Lawrence leaned against the wall and asked Major Trifale and Lieutenant Set with a serious face. As soon as he returned to the station, Lawrence told the two about the situation between him and Paulie without hiding anything, and even briefly told them about the agreement that Paulie had reached with the British. Lieutenant Seth stood there in a daze, still not recovering from the fact Lawrence had just told them. Major Trifale's expression was so gloomy that water could drip out of it. He never thought that he would be treated like this after dedicating half his life to the National Defense Army. In other words, Lieutenant Colonel Bonaparte, General Paulie now regards you as a thorn in his side. Major Tripoli gritted his teeth and said, "This reinforcement is actually just to suppress you and bury the 4th Battalion on the battlefield." Lawrence nodded slowly and added, "Strictly speaking, it's not to suppress me, but to suppress me and you, as well as you, Lieutenant Seth, and all the soldiers of the original 4th Battalion. In Paula's eyes, these are all my followers." Silence once again became the theme between the three. Major Tripoli and Lieutenant Seth could not accept that General Paulie, to whom they had once offered their loyalty, would treat them like this. After a long time, Lawrence took the initiative to break the silence and said, "That is to say, the three of us are on the same ship. It is impossible to expect Paulie to change his mind. There is only one way left for us." Major Cui Fally asked in an almost trembling voice, "Which one?" Lawrence shook his head and said, "I will let you know as soon as I return to Ajaccio. At that time, I will still need your help." The two people in front of Lawrence looked at each other. Neither spoke, but nodded firmly. They had no choice. Although they didn't know what the road Lawrence was talking about was, Major Cui Fally and Lieutenant Seth could already foresee. Corsica, I'm afraid it's going to change. Thanks to the monthly ticket support of the book friend Feng Ling Iuxiu. Chapter 91 Sniper Tactics, Part 1. 1770 was the 4th day since Lawrence arrived in Bonifacio. On the outskirts of Bonifacio, on a plain with a wide view, more than 20 people lined up in a row, holding their muskets steadily, aiming at the targets placed in the distance, and firing rounds of volleys. Among these people, except for the patrolmen Lawrence brought from Ajaccio, they were all veterans selected from the soldiers of the original 4th Battalion, who were most proficient in the use of muskets. Although Lawrence decided to put the rifle into actual combat in this battle, it did not mean that Lawrence was ready to fully disclose this new weapon. Before he could mass produce rifles, Lawrence was not prepared to give up this huge military advantage in his hands. Therefore, the soldiers selected here were also selected by Lawrence himself, the most loyal subordinates to him, to prevent the leakage of secrets. Cough cough. After a round of volleys, Lawrence stretched out his hand to clear the white smoke in front of him. He coughed twice and asked Major Cui Fally beside him, "Major, how is the training going?" Major Cui Fally squinted his eyes, walked forward for a distance, looked at the targets, turned back and shouted, "Not bad. There is no difference in the use of these guns and smoothbore guns. After a few days of shooting training, the hit rate has improved rapidly." Lawrence nodded, turned around and told the soldiers to stop training and rest for a while. But then again, Lieutenant Colonel Bonaparte Tripoli walked to Lawrence and whispered, "I still don't think these 20 odd people can do anything. Even if they can hit the target every time, they can only kill 300 enemies at most in a battle, and that's if they don't lose any personnel." Lawrence sat cross-legged on the spot, shook his head and said, "They don't need to kill 300 people. As long as they can kill 30 people, our army will be sure to win." 30 people? How is that possible? Major Tripoli was full of doubts, and hurriedly sat next to Lawrence, asking repeatedly, 30 people are only 1% of the enemy's strength. Why do you say that? In Major Tripoli's eyes, if all soldiers can be equipped with rifles, then they can use line tactics at a longer distance, so that they can shoot more rounds before the enemy approaches, thereby gaining an advantage. Therefore, Major Tripoli really doesn't think these 20 odd rifles are of any use. Lawrence glanced at Major Tripoli and sighed slightly. He also knew that Major Tripoli had his own limitations. As a man who had used line tactics for most of his life, it was difficult for Major Tripoli to break away from this mindset. So Lawrence pointed at the rifles in the soldiers' hands and said slowly, "What if these 30 people are the commander, deputy commander, messenger, and drummer of each array?" This Major Tripoli listened to Lawrence in a daze, and was mesmerized by the rifles in the hands of the soldiers. In any case, as a soldier who had experienced many battles, Major Tripoli quickly understood what Lawrence meant. In line tactics, the soldiers of both sides would face each other, and be directly exposed to the muzzles of the other side, and the distance between the two sides was only tens of meters. Such tactics brought tremendous psychological pressure to ordinary soldiers. Few people could remain calm when being pointed at by dozens of muskets. Therefore, the commander of each array had to go to the front line in person to stabilize morale and deter deserters. Of course, these commanders would not stand directly in the front line of the exchange of fire. After the exchange of fire began, they would retreat behind their soldiers to serve as cover. In the musket shooting, such human cover was already relatively safe. Although the probability of officers being hit by stray bullets existed, it was much lower than the probability of ordinary soldiers being killed. However, Major Tripoli swallowed his saliva subconsciously when he thought of this. Under the precise shooting of these rifles, the enemy officers and messengers who were only a few dozen yards away were just like targets. And most of the time they were not even moving targets. Once the enemy's command system was in chaos, Major Tripoli knew the consequences without thinking. Lawrence glanced at Major Tripoli, and from his blank expression, Lawrence knew that he had understood what he meant. Standing up and patting the dirt on his body, Lawrence was about to continue commanding the soldiers to train, but he saw a figure running towards him hurriedly not far away. Lawrence did not recognize the newcomer, but judging from his uniform, he should be a soldier of the Southern Army. As soon as he ran to Lawrence, he was so tired that he could not straighten his back. He panted and said, "Lieutenant Colonel Bonaparte, I finally found you. Colonel Silver wants to see you." "It's urgent." "It's urgent?" Lawrence exchanged glances with Major Tripoli. After nodding to each other, Major Tripoli organized the soldiers here to return to the camp, and Lawrence followed the soldier to meet Colonel Silver. Before arriving at the fortress where Colonel Silver lived, Lawrence found something unusual in Bonifacio. A perfect version of the book in 16:9. The streets were full of soldiers coming and going, and their figures were very hurried. They all carried wooden boxes of different sizes on their shoulders, and seemed to be moving something in a hurry. Even in the bay north of the city, several schooners flying the Corsican flag were busy loading goods and preparing to leave. When Lawrence saw Colonel Silver again, his room was much simpler than a few days ago, with only a wooden table and a few chairs. The documents on the table and the decorations on the wall, including his own personal belongings, were gone, and they must have been transported out of here. "Colonel Silver, what's going on now?" Lawrence asked while leaning on Colonel Silver's table without sitting down. Colonel Silver stood in front of the window, with his back to Lawrence, and said in a flat tone, "The Sardinian army has landed in southern Corsica. As we expected, their first target is Bonifacio. What about the situation in the city?" Lawrence frowned and asked, "Have you transferred all the supplies?" Colonel Silver turned half of his body, nodded to Lawrence, and said, "Most of the city's supplies will be transferred to Ajaccio by a small force, to prevent them from falling into the hands of the enemy. The rest of the troops will take the initiative to attack and fight the Sardinian army." Lawrence nodded silently, and did not speak. He thought that Colonel Silver had used all means to prevent himself from staying behind to defend the city, and directly transferred all the supplies in the city. Seeing that Lawrence did not respond, Colonel Silver continued, "I'm going to launch an attack tomorrow. Lieutenant Colonel Bonaparte, please coordinate your troops." "I understand." Lawrence did not waste words, simply saluted, and then turned and left the fortress. Staring at Lawrence's back disappearing into the stairwell, Colonel Silver couldn't help licking his lips, and said to himself greedily, "Don't blame me, Lieutenant Colonel Bonaparte. General Pauly got me a British title. Even if General Pauly didn't say it, I wouldn't let you affect the signing of the treaty." After that, Colonel Silver turned around and looked at the scenery outside the window. After all, he had been stationed here for several years. Now he was about to say goodbye to Bonifacio and take his soldiers to die, which also made Colonel Silver a little sad. However, Colonel Silver immediately shook his head in self-mockery and murmured, "What am I thinking about? Who cares about this remote place? When I get the title, I will go directly to London and become a nobleman with an annuity. Corsica, Corsicans, who cares?" Chapter 92 Sniper Tactics, Part 2. 1770. Outside a natural harbor in the south of Corsica. Due to the weakness of the overall national strength, the strength of the Corsican navy is also quite weak. At most, it can clear out pirates or smuggling ships in the surrounding areas. Once it encounters a regular navy, it can only shrink in the home port of Ajaccio. Therefore, the vanguard of the Sardinian army, these 3,000 people, easily landed on this natural harbor from Sardinia. After landing, the Sardinian army cut down trees outside this harbor to open a road and set up a simple camp as a bridgehead for subsequent operations. At this time, on the morning of March 7th, in the Sardinian army camp, the commander of this vanguard, Colonel Bartram, was sitting in his tent, discussing the next action plan with several adjutants. In front of them was a very simple map of southern Corsica, which was snatched from a hunter in the surrounding area. Although the lines on the map were crude, the general location and information were basically correct. Well, according to my intelligence, a Corsican troop was sent to the south for reinforcement a few days ago. Colonel Bartland pointed to the location of Bonifacio on the map and said to everyone, so they must be stationed in Bonifacio at this moment. Several adjutants and staff officers nodded, and no one would comment on such an obvious thing. Among the few cities in the south, only Bonifacio has the most rugged terrain and is a natural giant fortress. Colonel Bartland continued, then we have to prepare to besiege Bonifacio now. A staff officer raised his hand to express his disagreement and then pointed to Ajaccio and asked, can't we bypass Bonifacio? Go directly north to attack Ajaccio. The other adjutants and staff officers also nodded in agreement. In their eyes, the main force of the Corsican army is still fighting against the Genoese army in the north, and they will not be blocked from advancing in the south. However, Colonel Bartram sighed, turned his eyes away from the map, and said slowly, it is feasible from a military perspective, but not politically feasible. Looking at the puzzled expressions of the crowd, Colonel Bartram added, the British warships are still in Ajaccio, and it is said that the Corsicans and the British are conducting some negotiations. The King's Court is still discussing whether to risk hostility with the British to attack Ajaccio. We should not act rashly before receiving orders. Several people nodded in understanding, and someone said casually, damn British, if they hadn't interfered, we could have landed directly in Ajaccio. The others nodded in agreement and couldn't help but start complaining. Alright. Colonel Bartland slapped the table impatiently, pointed at the map and said, our goal is to control southern Corsica first. Even if we don't attack Ajaccio, we must occupy the silver mine. The most important thing now is to control the fortress of Bonifacio. Yes. Everyone nodded and approved of Colonel Bartland's plan. At this moment, an officer suddenly broke into the tent. His pants were still stained with mud and dew, as if he had just come back from outside. Colonel Bartram frowned at the intruding officer and recognized that he was the commander of one of his reconnaissance companies, so he asked in a deep voice, have you discovered any situation? Yes, Colonel. The company commander took 2 breaths and said in a strange tone, I received a report from my men that a Corsican army was approaching us. Corsican army? They are not hiding in Bonifacio, but appearing near us? General Bartram widened his eyes and asked in disbelief, how many people are there and how far away are they? Everyone present knew very well that the main force of Corsica was still in the north, so the troops that appeared here could only be the southern corps stationed in Bonifacio. The company commander took out a piece of paper, glanced at it, and reported, there are no more than 1,000 people, and they are at least 2 hours away from our camp. No more than 1,000? The company commander's words immediately made several people in the tent look at each other, and then burst into laughter. Could it be that they heard that we were coming, and came to surrender on their own initiative? You didn't mistake a group of bison for the Corsican army. How could they take the initiative to attack? General Bartram nodded to the reconnaissance company commander, indicating that he could go out, and then said to his subordinates seriously, okay, no matter what, don't take it lightly. Notify all battalions to assemble immediately, leave 1 battalion to garrison, and the rest of the troops prepare to march. The terrain around Bonifacio is a flat alluvial plain with few hills and mountains. A correct version of the book in 16:9. Standing on the grassland and looking far away, in good weather conditions, you can even see things a few kilometers away. Report. Colonel Silver, we can already see the enemy. A soldier in the southern army pointed to the small black dot that was constantly moving at the line between the sky and the earth in the distance, and reported to Colonel Silver on horseback. Colonel Silver squinted his eyes and looked into the distance, then said to Lawrence beside him, Lieutenant Colonel Bonaparte, the Sardinian army is approaching us. We have to start arranging the formation. Lawrence glanced at him, and like several other officers, he jumped off his horse and followed Colonel Silver's instructions. Ahem. I plan to divide the corps into two parts, the front army and the rear army. Colonel Silver staggered off his horse and instructed the officers. The front army is composed of Lieutenant Colonel Bonaparte's task force battalion and is also commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Bonaparte, responsible for direct combat against the enemy. As for the other soldiers, they will be assigned to the rear army, commanded by me, responsible for supporting combat. Do you understand? You. Major Trifoli stared at Colonel Silver and took a step forward angrily. He didn't need to think to know that this so-called rear army was set up to retreat at any time and betray the task force battalion to the enemy. Trifoli. Lawrence frowned and stretched out his hand to stop Major Trifoli, turned his head, and nodded to Colonel Silver and said, I understand. Our front army will go to arrange the formation first. After that, Lawrence pulled Major Trifoli and Lieutenant Set on the horse and led his troops to continue moving forward. Lieutenant Colonel Bonaparte, you can't have failed to see that the bastard Silver was just planning to run away when we were at a disadvantage. On horseback, Major Trifoli said anxiously to Lawrence, this damn guy can't even see the shadow of the enemy, and he's still thinking about plotting against us. Yes, sir. Lieutenant Seth also said worriedly, with just the people of us, we can't hold out for long under the enemy's firepower. Lawrence spurred his horse at a quick pace, turned back and waved to Colonel Silver with a smile, then turned his head to regain his stern expression, and said in a deep voice, don't forget, it's not the number of people that will help us defeat the enemy. Moreover, their rear army will join the battle at that time. Will they join the battle? Lieutenant Colonel Bonaparte, are you sure? Although Major Trifoli had great trust in Lawrence, he still asked with some concern. Lawrence turned his head slightly and glanced at Silver with cold eyes. He remembered his appearance deeply, then looked at Major Trifoli, nodded softly and said, if our dear Colonel Silver encounters any accident on the battlefield, then I will have no choice but to accept the order and be forced to take over the command of the Southern Legion. Chapter 93 Sniper Tactics, Part 2. Well, the Corsicans reacted pretty quickly. Colonel Bartram straightened his back, sat on his horse, and looked at the Corsican army's movements with a silver-studded telescope. There was endless grassland within a few miles, with no hills or trees to block the view. Even the grass underfoot was only knee-deep at its deepest. In this terrain, combined with today's almost cloudless weather, both sides could see the other side's formation at a glance. Their number is indeed less than 1,000, which is really strange. Colonel Bartram put down the telescope, touched his chin and said thoughtfully, there is no possibility of an ambush around. What are they thinking? Who cares, Colonel? A staff officer shook his head disdainfully and said, it is surprising enough to me that this group of Corsican savages can be lined up in a neat array. What tactics they can have, maybe they will have them in a few hundred years. Well, that's true. Colonel Bartram nodded with a smile. As an officer from a military academy, he's somewhat contemptuous of this army from a remote area. Pass on my order. 3 battalions of troops will be arranged in a square formation and advance towards the enemy. The other 2 battalions will be separated on both wings, ready to surround and annihilate the enemy from the flank at any time. Lieutenant Colonel Bonaparte, the Sardinian army has begun to move. Major Cui Farley squinted and looked into the distance. He could barely make out that the Sardinian army was gathering and arranging formations and slowly walking towards them. He couldn't help but said to Lawrence nervously. Lawrence held the reins tightly on his horse and took a few deep breaths to calm down. Unlike the last surprise attack on Sheephorn Bay, this time he was actually commanding an army on the battlefield. This was the first time for Lawrence, who had lived 2 lives. Fortunately, Major Trifoli and Lieutenant Set were both experienced veterans, so Lawrence didn't have to be responsible for the micromanagement on the battlefield, but only had to command the general military operations. They seem to want to surround us. Lawrence also looked at the movement of the Sardinian army from afar, watching the width of the enemy's front line continue to increase, slowly moving like a giant net, and said without surprise, this is consistent with what I expected. The Sardinian army has the advantage. They definitely not only want to win this battle, but also want to destroy our manpower and maximize the results of the battle. Major Cui Fally also nodded, feeling a little relieved, and said, "This is good news. Their flank troops cannot shoot during the encirclement, which will reduce the firepower pressure on our front." "That's right." Lawrence nodded lightly, pulled the reins and turned around, looking at the soldiers under his command. The soldiers have also received some news more or less in the past few days, knowing that they will face an enemy that is several times their number. Despair, tension, fear, trust, fanaticism. From their faces, Lawrence can read all kinds of emotions, these positive or negative emotions intertwined, shrouding all the soldiers in a solemn atmosphere. The formation in front of Lawrence was not silent either. He could hear the soldiers whispering about their uneasiness, and more often, there were soldiers holding iron crosses, closing their eyes, and leaning on their companions' shoulders, to pray in a low voice. "Maybe only God can help us win this battle." The soldiers holding the crosses thought so. Crack. Suddenly, there was a bang in front of the soldiers. The soldiers looked up in a daze, and saw that it was their superior, riding on a tall horse with a bay color, waving the whip, and whipping hard at the air. Lawrence slowly took the whip in his hand, and responded to every gaze that was staring at him. "Soldiers, listen to my orders, face forward, and tell me what you see." Lawrence's voice, which was close to a roar, reached everyone's ears. They looked ahead with blank minds, looking at the enemy troops advancing towards here, but no one answered. "Let me tell you, that is the Sardinian army, the army that brought plunder and slaughter to Corsica. Soldiers, imagine how these foreigners are showing off their power on the land of Corsica." Lawrence drew out his dagger, and pointed the blade at the invading Sardinian army. The tip of the knife turned into a dazzling spot of light under the bright sun. Despite the dazzling light, the soldiers still stared at the tip of Lawrence's knife and the direction it was pointing. They just arrived in Corsica yesterday. Their blades are still sharp and clean, and have not been stained with the blood of Corsicans. But Lawrence danced with the dagger in his hand, sheathed the knife, then looked at the soldiers with an excited expression and shouted, "If a nation is invaded, and the first drop of blood splashed is the blood of women, the blood of children, the blood of the elderly, and the blood of unarmed civilians, then I will use the most vicious language, to call the men of this nation cowards and cowards. Now, soldiers, behind us are the women, children, the elderly, and unarmed civilians of Corsica. What are your plans?" Lawrence rode his horse slowly through the formation, swept every soldier's face with sharp eyes, and asked sternly, tell me, this Florentine, are you ready to fight or retreat? Are the men of Corsica warriors or cowards?" Silence, deathly silence, lasted only a moment. Immediately following, there was a deafening sound wave. Check out the correct version on the 16:9 book forum. Fight. We are Corsicans. We are born warriors. Corsican men are born with swords in their hands. What's going on? Colonel Bartram frowned and raised his telescope again, but he couldn't see what was happening. He could only hear roars coming from the enemy's position. Who cares? Maybe the savages are going crazy. A staff officer curled his lips and said indifferently. Colonel Bartram also nodded in agreement, turned his head, and ordered the messenger beside him, notify the artillery to prepare for artillery fire, and order all battalions to speed up to prevent the enemy from escaping. About half an hour later, the distance between the two armies had shortened to about 600 meters, entering the range of the 6 3-pound artillery behind the Sardinian army. The Sardinian artillery continued to pour shells on the Corsican army. Almost every 10 seconds, a shell whizzed over the soldiers' heads and hit the ground heavily, raising a cloud of dust. Lawrence grabbed the reins and reined in the frightened horse. Even if these shells did not hit, the loud noise and the dust raised had almost made the livestock under his crotch out of control. Damn it. Lawrence, who was not good at riding, saw that he could not control the livestock, so he simply turned over and jumped over a shell crater, pointed his sword at the approaching Sardinian army, and shouted, "Soldiers, move forward. I'm with you." Even in the artillery fire, the soldiers of the special battalion could not help but be stunned for a moment. They really couldn't believe that the commander had abandoned his mount and shuttled through the array under the artillery fire like them. At this moment, even the most cowardly soldier gritted his teeth, held the musket tightly in his hand, and walked through the smoke in front of him with a firm step. Well, but, just as I planned. As the supreme commander, Colonel Bartram certainly would not go to the front line in person, but would observe the battle situation with a telescope about 300 yards away from the battlefield. The two armies had been exchanging fire for a while, and the continuous sound of gunfire echoed in this plain. The smoke produced by the burning gunpowder gathered together to form a large slowly rising white cloud, covering the battlefield. Very good, the troops on the flank are in place. Colonel Bartram looked at the situation on the battlefield, licked his lips excitedly, and shouted to the people around him, "Messenger, notify the 2 battalions on the flank to start encircling and killing all the enemy troops in it." However, to Colonel Bartram's surprise, no one responded to him, and only bursts of gunfire came to his ears. "Messengers, where are those messengers? Damn them!" Colonel Bartram roared, and looked around on his horse, but there were only himself and a few staff adjutants present. His adjutants and staff officers also looked at each other in panic, and no one knew why those messengers did not come back to report. Chapter 94 Seizing Power. On the battlefield, the exchange of fire between the two armies continued. Some of the Sardinian frontline officers soon discovered something unusual, because the distance between the two armies was only about 20 meters. These officers soon noticed that, in the Corsican army's array, there were always about 20 soldiers outside the line, wandering around behind the array and observing, and occasionally stopping to shoot with their muskets. At first, they didn't care about this detail, thinking it was just a manifestation of the Corsican army's lack of discipline. However, as more and more lines appeared chaotic in command, the soldiers who had finished loading their muskets held up their muskets, but had not received the order to fire, and other officers realized that something was wrong. Of course, with the deadly sniping of these precision shooters, these frontline officers who discovered the abnormality had no chance to report their findings after a while. Even in the Sardinian army's line, some soldiers who took over the command of the fallen officers had just opened their mouths to give 2 orders, and were immediately ruthlessly shot through the forehead by a bullet. PFFT. Ugh. Lawrence lay on the ground, holding back the nausea in his esophagus, and spit out the dust in his mouth, which he had just eaten, when he lay down, to avoid a round of artillery fire. Lieutenant Colonel Bonaparte, Major Trifoli rushed up from the back, and carried Lawrence back a distance, away from the front line of the exchange of fire. "Oh my god, how can you run to the front line?" Major Trifoli asked, while helping to pat the dirt off Lawrence's body. Lawrence waved his hands and whispered quickly, "I must appear at the front line. Only when I'm here will these soldiers fight for me. Let's not talk about this. How is the battle going?" Lawrence had been commanding those precision shooters at the front line just now, and he was not clear about the overall situation on the battlefield. "It's much better than expected. Many lines of the Sardinian army have fallen into chaos, and even several companies that have directly engaged us have begun to retreat," Major Trifoli said with a serious face. "But our losses are not small. We can't continue to waste time like this. But if Silva's troops participate in the battle, we may really have a chance to win this battle." "I understand." Lawrence stood up and motioned Major Trifoli to return to his post, then turned around and called a precision shooter from the array. "Sir, what instructions?" the shooter said to Lawrence anxiously, while loading ammunition with a ramrod. Lawrence patted his shoulder and whispered something in his ear. "Yes, sir." Although the shooter looked a little strange, he accepted Lawrence's order without hesitation. As a soldier of the former 4th Battalion, he was used to obeying, and only obeying Lawrence's orders. Lawrence nodded, and then ran towards the rear army, where Colonel Silva was. "Lieutenant Colonel Bonaparte, the battle situation is very tense." Colonel Silva sat on horseback, looked at Lawrence with a complicated expression, and said in a deep voice. In his plan, he thought that the hundreds of people in the special battalion would be defeated in a very short time, and then he could lead his confidants to retreat on horseback and successfully complete the goal assigned to him by Paulie. However, the situation on the battlefield was somewhat beyond Colonel Silva's expectations. "Colonel, your rear troops should join the battlefield." Lawrence looked up at Silva and said in a calm tone, "Don't be impatient." Colonel Silva shook the reins impatiently and said with a specious argument, "Now is not the best time. You go back to your position first." Lawrence sneered and stared at Colonel Silva and said, "Not yet? When are you going to mobilize your army?" When you return to Ajaccio, you. Colonel Silver's veins were exposed immediately. The soldiers and non-commissioned officers around him heard Lawrence's words, and they were also very dissatisfied with Colonel Silver's behavior of watching the fire from the other side of the river. After all, they also heard when Lawrence gave a speech to his subordinates just now. Now Lawrence's soldiers are fighting bloody battles with the enemy 200 yards away, but they are standing by and watching from the rear like cowards and cowards, as Lawrence said, which makes the soldiers of the Southern Corps very ashamed and sorry. If such a thing is spread, it will be a lifelong humiliation for them. Lieutenant Colonel Bonaparte, this is a battlefield. You dare to disobey orders on the battlefield? Colonel Silver pulled out his whip in anger and pointed at Lawrence and shouted, "I'm just proposing to you." Lawrence still said expressionlessly, "Proposal? I said you are disobeying orders. I will punish you by military law now." Colonel Silver shouted angrily, stretched out his hand, and waved the whip in his hand, flicking his wrist towards Lawrence. The thumbstick whip made a whistling sound in the air, and Lawrence was about to have a bleeding whip mark on his body. Colonel Silver suddenly trembled all over, and the whip in his hand was thrown out directly without power. His eyes gradually collapsed, and he stood on the horse's back like a wooden sculpture. A correct version in 1619 book bar. Before the soldiers could come to their senses, they saw that blood had begun to spurt out from a small hole in Colonel Silver's heart. "Colonel Silver." Lawrence pretended to be panicked and shouted, and immediately said, "Colonel Silver was hit by a stray bullet. Where is the military doctor? Take him to the emergency room." As he said that, Lawrence took a step forward and pulled Silver off his horse. His whole body fell heavily to the ground with a thud. Under the stunned gaze of everyone, Lawrence reached out to feel Silver's breath, and then said sadly, "Colonel Silver has left us, but we have no time to be sad. We are still fighting with the Sardinian army. We must comfort his soul in heaven with victory. Now, as the highest ranking officer present, I will take over as the commander of the Southern Corps. Do you have any opinions?" You. Colonel Silver on the ground had not yet died and was struggling to sit up. Lawrence glanced at him, stepped on him quickly, and pressed Silver to the ground until he no longer had any reaction. "Damn, that bunch of rubbish. What's going on?" Colonel Bartram anxiously looked at the situation on the battlefield with a telescope, cursing uncontrollably. According to his battle plan, as long as the two battalions on the flanks surrounded the Corsican army, the Corsican army would immediately collapse under the firepower attack from three sides. However, after the two battalions arrived at the designated position, they did not surround it for a long time, but stood still, as if they had not received any orders, and all the messengers sent out by Colonel Bartram himself never returned. Even just now, Colonel Bartram was forced to send his adjutants out to convey orders, but they also did not come back to report. At this time on the battlefield, the rear army of the Corsican army reinforced the battle from both wings, and instantly dispersed the two battalions that Colonel Bartram planned to surround. Because the two battalions on the flanks did not receive orders to attack or continue to advance, they did not react until the Corsican army rushed to their front and fired several rounds. They hastily changed the square formation into a line formation to fight. How could this happen? Colonel Bartram stared at the image in the telescope in a daze. Not only were the troops on the flanks attacked by the Corsican rear army, but even the three battalions in the frontal firefight gradually showed signs of decline. These pigs. They have better equipment and more people. Why are they retreating? Colonel Bartram angrily threw the telescope on the ground and roared in anger. But there was no one around him who could respond to him. Even all his adjutants were sent to the battlefield and have not returned yet. I want to see for myself what happened on the battlefield. Colonel Bartram could no longer suppress his anger, and he swung the reins hard and galloped towards the battlefield. Chapter 95 Great Victory. Oh my god. What on earth is going on? A Sardinian soldier on the front line of the crossfire collapsed and dropped his musket, crying and shouting. Then he held his head with both hands and fled back desperately. "Hey, John, what are you doing?" A soldier beside him hurriedly grabbed his arm and shouted, "Do you want to be a deserter? Don't bother with me, can't you see?" The soldier named John struggled to shake off his companion's pull and shouted palely, "The company commander is dead, the captain is dead, and the lieutenant is dead. Who can take care of us?" After that, John ignored his companions who were stunned in the same place and ran away to the back with a distorted expression. Such situations are happening everywhere in the Sardinian army. These soldiers recruited from the mainland of Sardinia were originally peasants who had only received simple training. When the battle situation fell into a disadvantage and even the officers supervising them were killed, the fear in their hearts was finally aroused. When the first few people took the lead in running away, the avalanche effect they caused immediately spread to the entire Sardinian army. More and more soldiers began to throw away their muskets and ran away without looking back. Major Trifoli stared at the faces of the Sardinian soldiers on the battlefield. Judging from their panicked and terrified expressions, the only thing the Corsican army had to do was to pursue the victory. Lieutenant Colonel Bonaparte, the morale of the enemy has completely collapsed. Major Trifoli couldn't help but say excitedly. Facing an enemy 3 times their own number, the Corsican soldiers were actually pressing forward to pursue the enemy. If they hadn't experienced it personally, every soldier, including Major Trifoli, would not believe it. Notify the company commanders. Lawrence's expression was still not relaxed, and he ordered Major Trifoli, don't be too hasty when pursuing, so as to prevent the enemy from reorganizing. Wait, what is that? Just as Lawrence gave the order, he saw a rider galloping wildly from the rear of the Sardinian army in his sight. He rode through the periphery of the formation, gathering the scattered soldiers like a shepherd, while raising the whip in his hand and ruthlessly whipping the fleeing soldiers, shouting something in his mouth. You bastards. Go back to your positions. Colonel Bartram mercilessly whipped the soldiers with their backs to him, roaring like a bull, and even Lawrence, who was hundreds of yards away, could hear his voice. Yes, yes, Colonel Bartram. Oh my god. We are still. Many of the fleeing Sardinian soldiers looked at Bartram and the whip in his hand in fear, and stopped hesitantly. Lieutenant Colonel Bonaparte, this is not good. Major Trifle frowned and watched Colonel Bartram gradually regroup his troops, and said worriedly, if the Sardinian army was allowed to regroup, even if the Corsican army had already established a victory, it would inevitably suffer a strong counter-attack in the pursuit. Lawrence looked at Bartram from a distance, shook his head indifferently, and said slowly, the appearance of this commander is just right. Huh? What do you mean? Major Trifle asked after a pause. Give them hope, and then let the hope be shattered. In this way, this unit will completely lose its combat effectiveness. As soon as Lawrence finished speaking, a precision shooter on the battlefield calmly pulled the trigger. In the gun barrel, the gas produced by the explosion of gunpowder accumulated at the tail of the bullet, pushing the bullet to fly out of the gun barrel along the rifling at high speed. The rotating bullet flew out of the muzzle steadily, disturbing the airflow in the air, and cutting a visible trajectory that existed for a very short time. This bullet passed through the battlefield full of corpses and blood, and passed over the heads of the Sardinian soldiers. For some reason, Colonel Bartram always felt that in the moment just now, there was a gunshot that was particularly harsh, even covering the whistling wind in his ears. But he no longer had time to think about such crazy thoughts. Puff. This is the sound of bullets tearing clothes and hitting the human body. Fortunately, the bullet did not penetrate into Colonel Bartram's heart as the shooter expected, but directly embedded into his thigh. Colonel Bartram, who was suddenly injured, suddenly lost his strength in his legs and fell off the high-speed galloping horse with an unstable body, hitting the ground and fainting directly. The Sardinian soldiers who had just regrouped had a blank mind and watched Colonel Bartram fall off the horse and roll on the ground for several circles before stopping. After a moment of stagnation, someone immediately shouted, "Colonel Bartram is dead." This panicked exclamation immediately became the last straw that overwhelmed the Sardinian army. More and more Sardinian soldiers couldn't help but repeat loudly, "Colonel Bartram is dead." At this moment, no one had the slightest thought of resistance, and the formation that had just gathered immediately became a piece of loose sand. The Sardinian soldiers were like a frightened herd of deer, not caring about what happened at all, and there was no other idea in their minds except to escape. Oh my god. A perfect version in the 16:9 book forum. Major Trifoli looked at the fleeing enemy in shock, shook his head and said, "I have been in the army for so many years, and I have never seen a unit collapse like this, not to mention that they still have a numerical advantage until now." Lawrence nodded slightly, took a long breath, and said in a deep voice, "They have been completely defeated. Major, notify all units to start chasing, but mainly to persuade them to surrender." "Understood." Major Tripoli nodded excitedly. The blood-like sunset splashed on this plain, making it difficult to tell whether the land under your feet was illuminated by the sunset or watered by blood. "Lieutenant Colonel Bonaparte, it's over. The prisoners have been accepted, the battlefield has been cleaned up, and the confiscated muskets and other equipment have been sent back to Bonifacio." Major Tripoli led his warhorse, and together with Lieutenant Set, walked to Lawrence with a heavy face and said, "This was indeed a great victory, but it was also a tragic victory that made Major Tripoli extremely sad. How much did we lose?" Lawrence glanced at Tripoli. From his expression, he could tell that the Corsican army suffered a lot of losses. About 900 of our soldiers participated in the battle, and nearly 500 were seriously injured or killed. Major Tripoli sighed, closed his eyes, and said uncomfortably, "At the same time, the soldiers of the former 4th Battalion were the most fearless and brave soldiers, and therefore, their casualties exceeded 60%. The evening wind whistled across the grassland, forming waves of grass. The crows that came from nowhere had already smelled the smell of the corpses, circling in the air like a black whirlwind, making a noisy cawing sound." Lawrence looked down at his feet. He didn't know whether it was the blood of the Sardinians or the Corsicans that flowed out, dyeing his boots bright red. "What about the Sardinian army?" Lawrence asked softly. "We captured about 1,000 people, and about 700 or 800 escaped." Lawrence nodded and turned to look behind Major Tripoli, where the soldiers of the Southern Army were standing in awe. There was no expression on their faces, no joy or excitement after a great victory, because the soldiers were still stepping on the blood of their former brothers. "Soldiers, my compatriots." Lawrence wiped the dust on his forehead, looked at the soldiers who had just survived the artillery fire, paced slowly and said, "The blood of those brothers who sleep under this grass will not be shed in vain. They have watered the land of Corsica with their blood. I also swear to you here that I will not let anyone touch the land they swore to defend with their lives." Lawrence walked step by step to the middle of the soldiers and shouted loudly, "And if there really are such rats who touch Corsica, brother soldiers, tell me, what will the Corsicans use to treat them?" Without any hesitation, Lawrence was responded to with a loud and low roar, "Sword and sword, iron and blood." Major Tripoli and Lieutenant Seth looked at Lawrence and the crowd silently. They both knew very well who the rat who touched Corsica Lawrence was talking about. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 96 Return, Part 1. 1770, 2 days after the Battle of Bonifacio. 10 miles away from Ajaccio, a 1-mile-long, mighty team was seen marching slowly and orderly on the official road. This was the special battalion led by Lawrence and nearly 1,000 captured Sardinian soldiers. After paying a heavy price to repel the Sardinian army, Lawrence still ordered the soldiers of the Southern Legion to garrison Bonifacio, and he led the special battalion back to Ajaccio immediately. Although there was not much time to consolidate his position in the Southern Legion, Lawrence knew very well that in a short period of time, the soldiers of the Southern Legion would regard his orders as the only orders to be executed. "Lieutenant Colonel Bonaparte, will we return to Ajaccio this time?" Major Trifle shook the reins, drove the horse closer to Lawrence, and whispered. As they got closer to Ajaccio, Major Tripoli became more and more uneasy. He still remembered the words Lawrence had said to him, and Lieutenant said that day. In Major Tripoli's opinion, although they had won a great victory this time, it might only make Paulie continue to increase the pressure on Lawrence's faction. Therefore, Major Tripoli even proposed a crazy plan to Lawrence on the way, directly lead the Southern Corps to occupy Ajaccio. However, this plan was quickly rejected by Lawrence. Because the garrison in Ajaccio, including Paulus Cuirassiers, are a very elite force in the National Defense Forces. Even if Lawrence has those precise shooters, it is difficult to be sure of taking Ajaccio. Even if Lawrence can take Ajaccio and imprison Paulie, Lawrence currently does not have the strength to fight against the British, Sardinians, Genoese, and even the northern corps led by General Nathan, who are waiting for an opportunity. Besides, it was also because Lawrence didn't want to turn his struggle with Paulie into a turmoil that endangered the whole of Corsica. Lawrence on horseback shook his head affirmatively and whispered, "We are the heroes of Corsica. Paulie will not take action against us in a short time. At most, he will try his best to transfer us away from Ajaccio like this time." That's true. Although Major Trifoli was still a little uneasy, he chose to believe Lawrence's judgment. By the way, Lawrence's face suddenly became solemn. He turned his head and waved to Lieutenant Set, motioning him to come closer. Then he said in a voice that only 3 people could hear, "The plan after returning to Ajaccio that I told you last time." Upon hearing this, Major Trifoli and Lieutenant CT immediately became fully alert, looking at Lawrence nervously, looking forward to every word he said. After whispering, under the shocked gaze of the two, Lawrence nodded to himself and rode a few steps faster, as if nothing had happened. In the afternoon, in the auditorium of the governor's palace in Ajaccio, "Mr. Peter, today's meeting went smoothly." After finishing the routine meeting with Peter, Paulie smiled and put away the documents on the table, stood up and invited, "Come to my garden for a cup of tea." Peter just nodded with a polite smile and followed Paulie to the garden of the governor's palace with the help of the servants. The two sat down at a small round table, and the matching tea sets were already prepared on the table. After sitting down, the two tacitly drove the entourage away, and both knew that this would not be a simple afternoon tea. Pitt took a sip of the teacup, looked up at the flowers and grass around him, and said casually, "The garden is very nice, Governor Paul. Thank you for the compliment." After some polite words, there was a brief silence between the two, and then Paul spoke first. "By the way, don't you care about that young man Lawrence? He should be back soon." Although Paul did not receive any letters from Bonifacio, judging from the time, Lawrence should return to Ajaccio in the next few days with a group of defeated soldiers. In Paul's opinion, taking advantage of Lawrence's defeat to deprive him of his power, and then sending him and Pitt back to England together, this is the best outcome. Peter nodded with a smile and said meaningfully, "You asked me to have tea, it shouldn't be just for this, right? Your Excellency is indeed very smart." Paulie was not surprised and said with a smile, "I mentioned to you some time ago that the army of the Kingdom of Sardinia has landed in Corsica. If I guessed correctly, they have occupied the southern part of Corsica at this moment." Peter glanced at Paulie with some dissatisfaction, frowned and said, "This is not a good thing for you as a leader, right? The alluvial plain in southern Corsica is an important granary for the entire island, not to mention that it is the farming season now." Paulie smiled awkwardly and said, "Not necessarily. If the Sardinian army occupied a large area of Corsica, although the Kingdom of Sardinia has not submitted a declaration of war, such an act is already a substantive war. So what? What do you want to say?" Peter's brows were still not relaxed. He put the teacup back on the table and looked at Paulie and asked, "A perfect version at 1619 book bar?" Paulie straightened his back and looked around. Although he knew there were only 2 people in the garden, he still said with a guilty conscience, "I hope that the English army can land in Corsica. Then I will announce the treaty with you, so that Britain can join the war and occupy Sardinia after repelling the Sardinian army and include Sardinia in the jurisdiction of Corsica." Although the sun was shining brightly in the garden and the singing of various rare birds was refreshing, Pitt's face turned gloomy in an instant, and he said sternly, "You gave up 1/3 of Corsica to the Sardinians just to get an excuse to occupy Sardinia." "Governor Paulie, although I'm a British, I still want to ask you if you have considered the people in southern Corsica." Paulie did not look into Pitt's eyes, but shook his head and said, "The people. Those farmers must be very proud. They are qualified to make sacrifices for Corsica." Pitt stood up with the table in dissatisfaction, shaking his head and said, "Sacrificed for Corsica? Pardon my impoliteness, Governor Paulie, I think they sacrificed for your title of Duke of Sardinia and Corsica." For Paulie, if he was only conferred the title of Count of Corsica, such a title would not satisfy Paulie's desire. Once he conquered Sardinia, he could definitely be conferred the title of a duke by virtue of the historical title of the Kingdom of Sardinia and Corsica. Seeing that the atmosphere in the garden was becoming difficult to end, Paula's secretary suddenly rushed in. "What's wrong? Didn't I say that no one is allowed to enter the garden?" Paulie immediately turned his head to look at his secretary and asked, ending the argument with Pete, "I'm sorry, Governor, but..." The secretary glanced in Pete's direction, as if he was hesitant to speak. "Speak quickly if you have something to say, Mr. Pete is one of us." Paulie noticed the secretary's hesitation and ordered impatiently. Although Pete could understand Italian, Paulie did not let Pete avoid him, in order to show his generosity. "Yes." The secretary swallowed his saliva, looked at Paulie in fear, hesitated for 2 seconds, and then said quickly, "Napoleon Bonaparte led the special battalion back to Ajaccio, and they repelled the Sardinian army, and brought back about 1,000 prisoners." "What?" Paulie was stunned and stood there, unable to stop, stepping back a few steps, and directly knocked over the round table full of tea sets to the ground, making a crackling sound. Pete was as shocked as Paulie. He also knew how weak the southern Corsica Corps was compared to the Sardinian army. Even as a meritorious leader who won the 7 Years' War, Pete did not have the confidence to do the same as Lawrence. Where is Lawrence now? Paulie did not pretend at all, and roared without caring about his face. "Mr. Governor, he is now parading in the streets of Ajaccio with his soldiers and captives, receiving cheers from the people." Chapter 97 Return, Part 2. It's been so many years. I haven't seen such a grand occasion for so long. An old man with grey hair and trembling face squeezed in the crowd on both sides of the street, muttering foolishly, looking at the long line of triumphant soldiers in the middle of the road. A citizen who was watching glanced at the old man, waved to the soldiers enthusiastically, and said excitedly, "This is the first time I have seen such a scene. I dare say that all the people in Ajaccio ran out of their houses. Look, from the East City District to the West City District, every street is packed. My God, I didn't know there were so many people in Ajaccio." The old man kept nodding and muttering, "But there was a time a long time ago." When? "Almost 20 years ago, when General Paoli liberated Ajaccio, but the scene at that time was far less than now. When the Sardinian prisoners walked in front of the people, every citizen cursed loudly, and the most unbearable words that they would never use on weekdays were thrown out loudly by the citizens at this moment. The captives were wearing blood-stained and tattered uniforms, smelling bad, with their hands tied behind their backs. They walked past the people with their heads down, insulted by the people. When the Corsican soldiers walked past the people with their heads held high and their chests puffed out, they were greeted by deafening cheers and flowers thrown from the crowd. Even the shop owners on both sides of the street closed their shops early and moved their goods directly to the street, generously stuffing all kinds of food and wine glasses into the hands of the passing soldiers. Even the peasants who have lived in Corsica all their lives have heard of the existence of the Kingdom of Sardinia, knowing that it is a country far richer and more powerful than Corsica. But, citizens of Ajaccio, now, look at what is in front of you. Look at those captives who are covered in dirt and can't raise their heads like ancient Roman slaves, and ask them where they are from and who defeated them. The Corsicans, who were discriminated against because of their poverty and backwardness, and were despised as mountain savages, could now hold their heads high in front of foreigners. As the leader of the entire team, Lawrence naturally became the focus of the whole audience. Countless freshly picked flowers with lingering fragrance flew towards Lawrence, and even the road in front of him was covered with petals, in advance by the cheering citizens. Even the war horse under Lawrence's crotch was so lively and lovely in the eyes of the citizens at this moment. From time to time, people squeezed out from both sides of the street and stuffed fresh carrots into the horse's mouth enthusiastically. Lawrence loosened the reins and let the horse walk freely in small steps. At the same time, he waved to the people on both sides of the street and even on the surrounding roofs with a smile on his face. "Lieutenant Colonel Bonaparte, I can't handle this kind of scene." Major Trifoli rode his horse to Lawrence's side and said with a bit of a smile. Lawrence turned his head to look at Major Trifoli. Like Lieutenant said, he kept laughing and shaking off the petals on his body. The two of them were wearing beautifully woven wreaths on their heads, which were shyly given to them by several young girls who squeezed out of the crowd. Lawrence hesitated for a moment, but still smiled, and said to the two of them, "Enjoy this moment." The reason why Lawrence deliberately led the troops to parade around the city in a grand manner was not for vanity and display, but for the sake of Major Trefali and Lieutenant Set. Only by pulling the two of them into the sun and exposing them to the attention of the public would Paulie be more cautious when he wanted to take action against them. Lawrence just lowered his head and pondered for a moment and suddenly heard a commotion in front of him. The citizens in front seemed to be more excited because of what they saw, and the cheers became more deafening. Lawrence was stunned for a moment, and then he reacted. What made these citizens more excited? Calculating the time, it is indeed time to show up. Lawrence sighed slightly, shook the reins, and quickened his pace to move forward. At the corner ahead, a neatly arrayed cuirassiers slowly walked out. Their armor shone brightly in the sunlight, and the chestnut-haired warhorses under their crotches looked even more majestic. Their leader, Pasquale Paoli, personally rode a pure white horse, smiling and greeting the citizens on both sides more skillfully than Lawrence. The two teams were still dozens of meters apart, but Lawrence could already see Paoli's attire. On such a special day, Paoli was indeed wearing his unique general's uniform, and he also wore a sword and a pistol on his waist, which was rare. Even the white horse under his crotch was covered with a set of leather gear according to the standard of a warhorse. Such attire was undoubtedly sending a signal. He, Paoli, was not only a soldier, but also Lawrence's direct superior, and today's honor also belonged to him. Here comes someone to take advantage of the popularity, Lawrence said to himself expressionlessly. Major Trefali and Lieutenant Set behind him had more complicated expressions. After learning the inside story that Lawrence told them, this was the first time they met the general who had made them sacrifice their blood. Check out the correct version on 1619 book bar. General Paulie, I'm back. Lawrence turned over and dismounted, holding the reins, and walking towards Paulie, saying with a fake smile. Paulie did not dismount, but just nodded to Lawrence on horseback, maintaining a seemingly enthusiastic smile, and deliberately said loudly, Lieutenant Colonel Bonaparte and the warriors of Corsica, I sincerely salute your triumphant return. In sharp contrast to the cheers of the citizens were Lawrence and the soldiers behind him. The soldiers looked at Paulie without any ripples. This set of hypocritical rhetoric could not erase the pain they suffered on the battlefield. On the contrary, many soldiers also saw that Paulie deliberately dressed up just to divide the honor they had earned with their blood. At this moment, in the eyes of the soldiers, Lawrence, who was bathed in the gunfire with them, was undoubtedly more worthy of following. I just fulfilled my duty. Lawrence bowed to Paulie without being humble or arrogant. Paulie nodded to Lawrence, but did not speak. Instead, he ordered the cavalry to turn their horses around and deliberately walked in front of Lawrence and his party to continue the unfinished parade. Lieutenant Set frowned and whispered beside Lawrence, Sir, they are obviously trying to steal our limelight. It is obviously us. Before the lieutenant finished speaking, Lawrence shook his head and made a shushing gesture. After a pause, he pointed to the soldiers behind him secretly and said in a deep voice, You know it, and they know it too. After that, Lawrence held the reins and followed the team, leaving Lieutenant Set standing there for a long time, not quite understanding it. The parade lasted until the evening, and until Lawrence and his party returned to the governor's mansion with Paulie, the streets and alleys were still hotly discussing everything that happened during the day. Walking into any tavern in Ajaccio, you can see people guzzling beer while telling their companions who missed the parade in an exaggerated manner. Paoli and Lawrence, the old and the young, have begun to be discussed on an equal footing. Many people have begun to sincerely hope, even pray, that when their beloved Governor Paoli leaves his post due to old age, this extraordinary young man will continue to lead Corsica. Of course, no one can say when this future will happen. Chapter 98 Disguise. Major Trifoli, Lieutenant Set, you can leave now. In the governor's mansion, Paula's study. As Paulie politely expressed his condolences to the three officers and promised rewards, the four people present also understood that the next time should be left to Lawrence and Paulie. Bang! The wooden door of the study was closed by Major Trifoli with a dull sound. Paulie's expression gradually turned cold from the hypocritical smile just now, and his eyes kept looking up and down at Lawrence. The light from the several oil lamps in the room was not bright, and the two of them could not see each other's expressions clearly, and could only see large shadows on their faces. There were only two people here, and Paulie had no intention of pretending anymore. The two sides had almost reached the point of breaking up, and the only thing left was the final tearing of their faces. Despite this, the two of them tacitly did not break this last layer of film. "Lawrence, I really want to know how you won the Battle of Bonifacio," Paulie said casually. His tone was very calm, as if he was just chatting with a stranger about tomorrow's weather. Lawrence was not in a hurry to reply. Based on his understanding of Paulie, this was just the calm before the storm. "To be honest, I don't know." Lawrence shrugged helplessly, tilted his head to one side and said, "You know, the last time I commanded the troops was 2 years ago." Paulie stared at Lawrence, as if he wanted to see through the shadow covering his face, and then sneered and said, "Lawrence, I don't know what means you have, but if you touch my bottom line, I will let you know what means I have." This night was the same as that day in the auditorium. There was still the constant noisy sound of insects, but it also filled a long silence between the two. After a long time, Lawrence suddenly sighed and said, "There are some things I have wanted to tell you for a long time. Maybe I'm not suitable for these." Paulie couldn't help but be stunned after hearing this. Even the sneer on his face disappeared. He asked with some doubts about his auditory hallucinations. "Not suitable for these? What are you talking about?" Lawrence sighed again, waved his hand and said, "The army, dealing with people, politics, struggle, these have made me very tired." Paulie opened his mouth, but didn't know what to say. This kid who he regarded as the #1 threat did not fall into the trap he designed several times, but wanted to take the initiative, to withdraw from all these events. "Lawrence, what do you want to say?" Paulie forced himself to calm down, and asked Lawrence in a deep voice. But in Paulie's tone, it was obvious that he could hear some excitement and trembling. Lawrence glanced at Paulie calmly, and continued with a sigh, "I was shocked by what I saw and heard on the battlefield these days. I found that Sir Pitt's invitation was more attractive to me. After all, who doesn't want to live a leisurely life with annuity from the title? I've had enough of this. Have you decided to agree to Sir Pitt?" Paulie immediately leaned forward. Although there was still some distrust in his eyes, the hostility in his words suddenly subsided a lot. Lawrence nodded solemnly and said, "Please tell Sir Pitt that I have decided to return to London with him." Paulie stood up and walked around the table in a confused manner, as if he was thinking about something, and looked up at Lawrence in surprise from time to time. Finally, Paulie nodded to himself and said to Lawrence in a deep voice, "Very good, very good. I know you are a sensible young man, and Sir Pitt will not treat you unfairly. I will tell him tomorrow morning. Oh, by the way," Lawrence suddenly interrupted Paulie and said, "I have another request." "Request? Go ahead." Paulie frowned and motioned Lawrence to continue. "As you know, I'm from Florence, and I have many relatives there." Lawrence's eyes dimmed a little, and he said with great concern, "I hope to bring them all with me on this trip to London." Of course, Sir Pitt has already allowed it. Relatives? Well, this is a must, but why are you telling me this? Paulie asked in confusion. Lawrence sighed again, shook his head in distress and said, "I have to say that they are all a bunch of old stubborn people. If I write a letter, they will definitely not agree to leave Florence, so I need to go back in person to persuade them." "You want to leave Ajaccio?" Paulie blurted out in surprise. He was just thinking about how to transfer Lawrence away from Ajaccio again before the treaty was signed, but he didn't expect Lawrence to take the initiative to ask to leave. For Paulie, as long as Lawrence himself was not there would be too many opportunities to suppress Lawrence's faction. Although Lawrence had just returned from a great victory, Paulie could not do too much, but there was still enough time for Paulie to weaken Lawrence's influence. In Paulie's eyes, Lawrence took the initiative to leave Ajaccio for a while, which was a naked show of weakness, and made Paulie completely believe Lawrence's words just now. Of course, no problem. Citizens have the freedom to enter and leave Corsica. Paulie's mouth was already slightly smiling. He had never expected such a good thing to happen tonight. A perfect version in the 16-9 book forum. The thorn in his eye, who he regarded as a big worry, actually took the initiative to withdraw from the struggle. This alone could make Paulie happily drink 3 glasses of whiskey. Not to mention that he had taken the limelight from Lawrence in the afternoon and took most of the glory of this triumph on himself. When Lawrence left the governor's mansion, Paulie even personally accompanied Lawrence out of the study and sent him to the door before waving to Lawrence and saying, "Goodbye, young man. Maybe we will meet again in London." "I hope so, Governor Paulie." Lawrence smiled and waved to Paulie, then walked forward without looking back. In Dongcheng district, Kolo was reading a biography novel in the living room of his home seriously. Suddenly, he heard a knock on the door. He asked the butler to open the door with some displeasure. When the butler brought the visitor into the living room, Kolo was surprised to find that the visitor was his younger brother Lawrence, and couldn't help saying, "Dear Lawrence, it's so late. Is there anything urgent?" Lawrence, who had just left the governor's mansion, came directly to Kolo's house. After seeing Kolo, he said straight to the point, "Brother, I heard that you have a friend worth making friends with, and I really want to get to know him." Kolo closed the book with some doubts and asked, "Friend? Who are you talking about?" "Count Marbeuf of France." "Marbeuf? He is indeed an outstanding talent." Kolo was stunned for a moment, frowned and said, "Huh? How do you know I know him?" In history, after France occupied Corsica, the Count Marbeuf became the governor of Corsica, and Carlo's family was also taken care of because of their relationship with Marbeuf. This is why Kolo was able to live a comfortable life in Corsica, after he and Paulie failed to resist the French in history. Lawrence also inferred their friendship, based on this history. When faced with Carlo's question, Lawrence just said casually, "I heard someone talk about it occasionally. So that's it." Carlo nodded in sudden realization. Of course, he didn't doubt his own brother at all, so he got up and found a pen and paper and said while writing, "I will write a letter of recommendation for you. Are you going to see him soon?" "Maybe, it's hard to say," Lawrence said vaguely. "So, I was thinking that you should bring an appropriate gift when you visit an earl like him." Carlo picked up the written letter of recommendation, blew the ink dry, handed it to Lawrence, and said, "By the way, maybe I should pick a gift for you?" Lawrence took the letter of recommendation, folded it gently, and put it in his purse, shook his head and said, "Thank you for your kindness, brother, but no need. I have prepared the best gift for him." Chapter 99 Arrangement. The next morning, in the Ajaccio patrol station, the patrolmen brought by Lawrence to Bonifacio returned to the station, after staying in the barracks for a night. As soon as these 10 people stepped into the gate of the station, they immediately attracted the attention of all the patrolmen. "Hey, Bank, you participated in that battle. Tell me what happened." "Muse, I saw you in the parade yesterday. I never thought you were so handsome. Oh my god, I envy you. How did Lord Bonaparte choose you?" Faced with a tide of questions from the crowd, these patrolmen just shook their heads and smiled bitterly, and answered some questions that were not related to the battle very carefully. When Lawrence selected them, the first criterion he valued was loyalty, and the second was their comprehensive ability. Therefore, these people always kept Lawrence's orders in mind, and did not reveal any of the situation on the battlefield at that time, let alone the effectiveness of the use of rifles. Okay. Old Scene in the crowd clapped his hands, signaling everyone to be quiet, and then waved and said, "They are probably exhausted, so don't disturb them. Let's take a good rest." Just as everyone was dispersing in disappointment, some sharp-eyed patrolmen suddenly found a young man in luxurious clothes, with ribbons on his cuffs, wearing a full set of coats, vests, and shirts, walking into the door. The patrolmen were stunned and stared at the young man for a while, before they recognized him with surprise. "It's Lord Bonaparte." Sure enough, the lord hasn't been to the garrison for a while. Everyone came up to look at Lawrence excitedly, and at the same time they were a little surprised. Why didn't their commander wear a uniform or military uniform today, but dressed so solemnly? Lawrence walked into the hall, waved to everyone, and then went straight to Old Scene and whispered, "Send someone to find Grosso and Jan, and be careful to hide your identity. The 3 of you come to the top floor to meet me." Old Scene took a look at Lawrence's serious expression, and immediately understood that something big was going to happen, so he nodded and agreed, while signaling the patrolmen to return to their posts. The last time they had such a tense and serious meeting was 2 years ago, when they planned to eliminate Zluo. This also made Old Scene full of energy, and he quickly sent someone to the West City district to inform Grosso and Jan. About an hour later, in the secluded storage room on the top floor of the station, the four people gathered here again. Hiss, Lawrence, are you going to a dance or something? I have to say you have good taste. Grosso still looked carefree. Although he was summoned urgently, he did not show any nervousness. He came up and commented on Lawrence's clothes in a very novel way. Jan looked at Lawrence respectfully without saying a word. Lawrence glanced at the three people. Even though he knew that there were only four of them on the entire top floor, Lawrence still stood up and closed the door of the storage room tightly. Seeing Lawrence's serious actions, Grosso quickly restrained his expression and looked at Lawrence seriously, probably guessing that what he was going to say next might not be simple. Remember the British ship that came to the port a few weeks ago? Lawrence looked at the three people and said in a deep voice. The three nodded. Although Lawrence did not tell them about the subsequent progress, after finding out Peter's identity, the incident itself caused a small sensation at the time. Lawrence pondered for a moment, sorted out his thoughts, and then said in one breath, I hope you will remember what I'm going to say next, and only remember it in your heart. After a whisper, just like the conversation with Major Trefalli and Lieutenant Set that day, Lawrence informed the three of them about the treaty between Pete and Paulie, his struggle with Paulie, and the conversation with Paulie yesterday. The storage room was as silent as a pool of stagnant water. The facts Lawrence said really exceeded the information they were exposed to on a daily basis. If anyone else told them the same thing, the three would have regarded that person as a mentally ill lunatic without hesitation. Before this, the three had not expected that they would be involved in a struggle about the fate of Corsica as a small patrolman. Jan recovered from the shock the fastest, looking at Lawrence calmly, waiting for the next order. No matter what, his fate was tied to Lawrence personally. Grosso frowned, lowered his head and thought, trying to sort out the context of this series of events. Old Scene's eyes were still dull until Lawrence finished speaking, staring blankly at the front, and even his breathing became a little weaker. As an old man, he joined the patrol since the founding of the Republic of Corsica, so his admiration for Paulie has lasted for more than 10 years. When the object of his admiration became an irreconcilable enemy, it was difficult for Old Scene to recover from this gap for a while. Boy, this is not good. I've seen the methods of the British. Grosso slapped the table and said hatefully, Corsica is no different from an American colony to them. The British policy towards the colonies is endless taxation and military service. Old men like Old Scene can be rushed to the battlefield. I understand. Lawrence nodded and said, moreover, the more important reason is that Britain's national strength is on the rise. If this goes on, I can predict that the Corsicans will not have the opportunity to be independent within 300 years. After that, Lawrence glanced at Old Scene, who was still in a daze, sighed and said, this is also the reason why Paulie and I broke up. In this sense, I have to apologize to you. It was me who dragged you into this struggle. Jan shook his head and said firmly, I'm with the adults. Check out the correct version at 1619 book bar. Well, I'm with you anyway. Grosso, who had experienced many ups and downs, shrugged and said indifferently, it's okay as long as I don't lose my life. Lawrence nodded solemnly to the two of them, and then the eyes of the three of them were all focused on Old Scene. Among the three of them, only Old Scene obeyed Lawrence because of his position, and the other two followed Lawrence directly. Now that Lawrence has parted ways with Paulie, Old Scene is also struggling in his heart, hesitating about which side he should choose. Old Scene, just follow your heart. Lawrence looked at him, slowed down his speech, and said in a deep voice, I know you are old. If you don't want to get involved in these things, I can allow you to continue to receive annuity from the patrolman's share, and send you away from Corsica to spend your old age. After saying this, Lawrence didn't say anything anymore, but just closed his eyes, and leaned back in the chair quietly, waiting for Old Scene to make a choice. Old Scene moved his lips, his voice trembling a little. He repeated it several times before he stabilized, and said with determination, I'm willing to serve Lord Bonaparte like the two of them. It was not until Lord Bonaparte came to the patrol that I found the meaning of being a patrolman in the past 2 years. Governor Paulie disappointed me a lot, and I don't want the patrol to return to the state where everyone despises it. I accept your service. Clarence leaned forward, nodded slightly in a serious manner, and then said to the three people, "In addition, I have told Paulie that I will leave Ajaccio for a period of time. During this period, I should be dismissed from the patrol." The three people looked at Clarence and nodded without surprise. They all knew in their hearts that, even if Clarence's position was revoked, the only leader of the more than 100 people in the patrol would only be him. After explaining the remaining trivial details to the three people, Clarence left the patrol station and walked towards the West City port. "The only armed force that can be directly mobilized in Ajaccio is already in my hands. What I need now is..." Clarence carried his luggage and whispered softly on the road, a sufficiently powerful external force to intervene. Chapter 100 A Crown. 1770. Toulon, a seaport city in the southeast of the Kingdom of France. This is the capital of the Var province in southern France, and it is also the most prosperous port city in France on the Mediterranean coast besides Marseille. Due to its special geographical location and excellent geographical environment, the home port of the French Mediterranean fleet is also set up here. Even until the 21st century when Clarence lived, Toulon port was still the largest military port in France. A small schooner departed from Ajaccio and was originally scheduled to sail to Florence. It was slowly approaching the port of Toulon. Clarence walked out of the cabin, stood on the deck, facing the sea breeze, and looked out at the hazy Toulon port in the morning mist. Although it is still dozens of kilometers away from the port, many sailboats can be seen around this sailboat, sailing towards Toulon like them. There are many French warships flying the Iris flag, but most of them are small patrol ships, which should be chasing pirates and guarding merchant ships. "Mr. Bonaparte, how was your rest last night?" The captain of the schooner walked behind Clarence and asked with a friendly smile. Clarence leaned against the side of the ship, tilted his head slightly, and said casually, "Not bad, but I'm sorry to bother you to change your destination at the last minute." In order to avoid Paula's suspicion, Clarence deliberately instructed Grosso to bribe a merchant ship captain who was scheduled to sail to Florence, so that he would turn to Toulon after going out to sea. No, you are Mr. Grosso's superior." The captain laughed twice and waved his hand carelessly. Clarence glanced at him and knew that it was not Grosso's face that worked. For these profit-seeking businessmen, only gold coins could drive them to serve themselves. As the rising sun pierced the morning mist on the sea, the schooner gradually sailed into the port of Toulon. After the tax officials at the dock learned that the ship was not unloading here, they impatiently asked Clarence to get off the ship quickly and then waved their hands to drive the schooner out of the port. However, for Clarence himself, given his gentlemanly attire, these tax collectors were also very sensible and did not make too many difficulties. After a few simple questions, they left. This is the port of Toulon. Clarence, carrying his luggage, stood on the dock and watched with interest for a moment. This place is much more prosperous than the port of Ajaccio. You can even see people of various identities and statuses from various countries on the dock. From Corsicans like Clarence, who look the same, to Swedes from northern Europe with beards and hair, and even Arab merchants wearing heavy turbans, and black slaves in shackles. Including the ship throughput of the port of Toulon, during the time Clarence stopped to observe, it was estimated that it was more than 10 times that of the port of Ajaccio. After observing for a while, Clarence quickly left the port. He was not here for a field investigation. The most important thing at the moment was to meet Count Marbeuf as soon as possible. Taking out Carlo's letter of recommendation, Clarence glanced at the address on it and then asked several locals in not so fluent French for the address. Clarence was not surprised to learn that Count Marbeuf lived in a manor in the countryside of Toulon. Unlike his brother Carlo's count, who was only a name, Count Marbeuf actually had his own fiefdom. For nobles like him, living in the city and crowding together with those smelly poor and uneducated citizens was an insult to their status. Therefore, although these nobles also had their own properties in the city, most of the time they would stay in the manor in the countryside, enjoying the service of dozens or even hundreds of servants. This trend, which has been prevalent since the Middle Ages, will not gradually dissipate until the urbanization process is further increased. In desperation, Clarence had to pay a coachman who was sitting idle on the street to take him to Count Marbeuf's manor. "Thank you, generous sir. God bless you." The coachman took the 2 livres thrown by Lawrence with a smile on his face, took off his hat and kept bowing. Lawrence nodded, and then couldn't help touching his sore butt. The carriages of this era, except for those of the rich, were equipped with spring shock absorbers, and there was no buffer system at all. Coupled with the poor road conditions in the French countryside, the bumps of the past few hours really made Lawrence feel that his bones were about to fall apart. Not long after Lawrence got off the car, a middle-aged man wearing a silver wig, a dark green vest and trousers came up to him. "Good afternoon, sir. I'm the steward of this manor. Who are you?" The manor steward bowed politely. According to his schedule, there were no guests visiting today, so when he found that a gentleman dressed like Lawrence had arrived, he quickly came out to greet him. Lawrence handed Carlo's recommendation letter to the butler and said in return, "I want to visit Count Marbeuf, please inform him." "Ah, please follow me." The manor butler took a look at the envelope of the recommendation letter, led Lawrence into the manor kindly, placed Lawrence in a small wooden house, and arranged for the servants to serve tea, and then immediately went to inform the master. After just a moment, the manor butler turned back, and his attitude became much more respectful. He led Lawrence to a well-decorated courtyard with fountains and busts. There was only one man in the courtyard, probably in his 30s, tall, with a slightly upturned mustache, wearing a clean white singlet and scarf, a very typical traditional aristocratic dress. At this moment, he was lazily reading the newspaper in his hand, and seemed very dissatisfied with the content inside. Every time he read it for a while, he would angrily close the newspaper and throw it aside, and then take it back. "Ah, you must be Lawrence. I heard Carlo mention you. You are indeed a handsome young man." The man noticed Lawrence coming in, threw the newspaper on the table, smiled and asked Lawrence to sit down. Lawrence also bowed slightly, and then sat next to Count Marbeuf. For these country estate owners, there are not many ways of entertainment, and chatting with visiting guests is a very common way of pastime. Therefore, Count Marbeuf immediately started chatting with Lawrence enthusiastically. "Dear Lawrence, how long do you plan to stay here? Don't be restrained. Your brother and I are good friends, real friends. By the way, why did you think of coming to Toulon? Are you bored of staying in Ajaccio? I would like to go there and take a look. You can tell me about the place in advance." Lawrence smiled bitterly after listening to a series of questions from Count Marbeuf, shook his head and said, "I probably won't stay in Toulon for too long. This visit to you is mainly to ask for your assistance in something. Help? Just tell me what you need, dear Lawrence," Count Marbeuf said, patting his chest. Lawrence slowly took out an exquisite gold-stamped envelope from his arms, gently placed it on the table, and said in a deep voice, "I would like to ask you to help me deliver a letter." "Deliver a letter?" Count Marbeuf shrugged, and said in a somewhat strange way, "Although I'm not a postman, I'm happy to do such a small thing. Who do you want to send it to?" "The king." "The king? Which king?" Count Marbeuf was stunned and said subconsciously, "King Louis." Lawrence said softly, "This?" Count Marbeuf couldn't help but frowned and said, "Dear Lawrence, I can indeed communicate with the king, but I have to know the content of this letter in advance. I can't disturb him with some trivial matters. The content of the letter is very simple. I want to send King Louis a gift." "Gift? Excuse me, the king's court has everything." Count Marbeuf frowned even more and gradually lost interest in the letter on the table. "Believe me, King Louis will be interested, and you will certainly benefit as my introducer." "Well, what is the gift, dear Lawrence?" Count Marbeuf asked, but he no longer had any expectations for Lawrence's gift. A crown. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.